The Baker's Daughter in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bethany Rook. The Baker's Daughter by Charles John Tibbets. A very long time ago, I cannot tell you when, it is so long since, there lived in a town in Herefordshire a baker who used to sell bread to all the folk around. He was a mean, greedy man who saw in every way to put money by, and who did not scruple to cheat such people as he was able when they came to his shop. He had a daughter who helped him in his business, being unmarried and living with him, and seeing how her father treated the people, and how he succeeded in getting money by his bad practices, she, too, in time came to do the like. One day when her father was away, and the girl remained alone in the shop, an old woman came in. "My pretty girl," said she, "give me a bit of dough, I beg of you, for I am old and hungry." The girl at first told her to be off, but as the old woman would not go, and begged harder than before for a piece of bread, at last the baker's daughter took up a piece of dough, and giving it to her, says, "There now, be off, and do not trouble me any more." "My dear," says the woman, "you have given me a piece of dough. Let me bake it in your oven, for I have no place of my own to bake it in." "Very well," replied the girl, and, taking the dough, she placed it in the oven, while the old woman sat down to wait till it was baked. When the girl thought the bread should be ready, she looked in the oven, expecting to find there a small cake, and was very much amazed to find, instead, a very large loaf of bread. She pretended to look about the oven as if in search of something. "I cannot find the cake," said she. "It must have tumbled into the fire and got burnt." "Very well," said the old woman. "Give me another piece of dough instead, and I will wait while it bakes." So the girl took another piece of dough, smaller than the first piece, and having put it in the oven, shut to the door. At the end of a few minutes or so, she looked in again, and found there another loaf, larger than the last. "Dear me," said she, pretending to look about her, "I have surely lost the dough again. There's no cake here." "'Tis a pity," said the old woman, "but never mind. I will wait while you bake me another piece." So the baker's daughter took a piece of dough as small as one of her fingers and put it in the oven, while the old woman sat near. When she thought it ought to be baked, she looked into the oven and there saw a loaf, larger than either of the others. "That is mine," said the old woman. "No," replied the girl. "How could such a large loaf have grown out of a little piece of dough?" "It is mine, it is sure," said the woman. "It is not," said the girl, "and you shall not have it." Well, when the old woman saw that the girl would not give her the loaf, and saw how she had tried to cheat her, for she was a fairy, and knew all the tricks that the baker's daughter had put upon her, she draws out from under her cloak a stick, and just touches the girl with it. Then a wonderful thing occurred, for the girl became all of a sudden changed into an owl, and flying about the room, at last made for the door, and, finding it open, she flew out and was never seen again.
The Enchanted Wine Jug, or Why the Cat and Dog Are Enemies, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Susan Kay. The Enchanted Wine Jug, or Why the Cat and Dog Are Enemies, by Horace Newton Allen. In ancient times there lived an old gray-haired man by the river's bank, where the ferry boats land. He was poor but honest, and being childless and compelled to earn his own food, he kept a little wine shop, which, small though it was, possessed quite a local reputation, for the aged proprietor would permit no quarreling on his premises, and sold only brand of wine, and this was of really excellent quality. He did not keep a pot of broth simmering over the coals at his door to tempt the passer-by, and thus increase his thirst on leaving. The old man rather preferred the customers who brought their little long-necked bottles and carried the drink to their homes. There were some peculiarities, almost mysteries, about this little wine shop. The old man had apparently always been there and had never seemed any younger. His wine never gave out, no matter how great might be the local thirst, yet he was never seen to make or take in a new supply, nor had he a great array of vessels in his shop. On the contrary, he always seemed to pour the wine out of the one and same old bottle, the long slender neck of which was black and shiny from being so often tipped in his old hand, while the generous warming stream gurgled outward to the bowl. This had long ceased to be a matter of inquiry, however, and only upon the advent of a stranger of an inquiring mind would the subject be rediscussed. The neighbors were assured that the old man was thoroughly good, and that his wine was better. Furthermore, he sold it as reasonably as other men sold a much inferior article. And more than this, they did not care to know, or at least, if they did once care, they had gotten over it, and were now content to let well enough alone. I said the old man had no children. That is true, yet he had that which in a slight degree took the place of children, in that they were his daily care, his constant companions, and the partners of his bed and board. These deputy children were none other than a good-natured old dog, with laughing face and eyes, long silken ears that were ever on the alert, yet too soft to stand erect, a chunky neck, and a large round body covered with long soft tan hair and ending in a bushy tail. He was the very impersonation of canine wisdom and good nature, and seldom became ruffled unless he saw his master worried by the ill behavior of one of his patrons, or when a festive flea persisted in attacking him on all sides at once. His fellow, a cat, would sometimes assist in the onslaught when the dog was about to be defeated and completely ruffled by his tormentor. This Thomas was also a character in his own way, and though past the days when his chief ambition had been to catch his tail, he had such a strong vein of humor running through him that age could not subdue his frivolous propensities. He had been known to drop a dead mouse upon the dog's nose from the counter, while the latter was endeavoring to get a quick nap, and then he would blow his tail up as a balloon, hump his back, and look utterly shocked at such conduct, as the startled dog nearly jumped out of his skin, and growling horribly, tore around as though he were either in chase of a wild beast or being chased by one. This happy couple lived in the greatest contentment with the old man. They slept in the little Kang room with him at night, and enjoyed the warm stone floor, with its slick oil-paper covering, as much as did their master. When the old man would go out on a mild moonlit night to enjoy a pipe of tobacco and gaze at the stars, his companions would rush out and announce to the world that they were not asleep, but ready to encounter any and everything that the darkness might bring forth, so long as it did not enter their master's private court, of which they were in possession. The old man, however, often recalled those former days with a shudder, and thought with great complacency of the time when he had befriended a divine being in the form of a weary human traveler, to whom he gave the last drink his jug contained, and how, when the contents of the little jug had gurgled down the stranger's throat in a long unbroken draught, the stranger had given him a trifling little thing that looked like a bit of amber, saying, "Drop this into your jug, old man, and so long as it remains there, you will never want for a drink." He did so, and sure enough the jug was heavy with something, so that he raised it to his lips, and, could he believe it, a most delicious stream of wine poured down his parched throat. He took the jug down and peered into its black depth. He shook its sides, causing the elf within to dance and laugh aloud, and shutting his eyes, again he took another long draught. Then, meaning well, he remembered the stranger, and was about to offer him a drink, when he discovered that he was all alone, and began to wonder at the strange circumstance, and to think what he was to do. "I can't sit here and drink all the time, or I will be drunk, and some thief will carry away my jug. I can't live on wine alone, yet I dare not leave this strange thing while I seek for work." Like many another to whom fortune has just come, he knew not for a time what to do with his good luck. Finally he hit upon the scheme of keeping a wine shop, the success of which we have seen, and have perhaps refused the old man credit for the wisdom he displayed in continuing on in a small scale, rather than in exciting unpleasant curiosity and official oppression, by turning up his jug and attempting to produce wine at wholesale. The dog and cat knew the secret, and had ever a watchful eye upon the jug, which was never for a moment out of sight of one of the 3 pairs of eyes. As the brightest day must end in gloom, however, so was this pleasant state soon to be marred by a most sad and far-reaching accident. One day the news flashed around the neighborhood that the old man's supply of wine was exhausted. Not a drop remained in his jug, and he had no more with which to refill it. Each man, on hearing the news, ran to see if it were indeed true, and the little straw-thatched hut and its small court, encircled by a mud wall, were soon filled with anxious seekers after the truth. The old man admitted the statement to be true, but had little to say. While the dog's ears hung neglectedly over his cheeks, his eyes dropped, and he looked as though he might be asleep, but for the persistent manner in which he refused to lie down, but dignifiedly bore his portion of the sorrow, sitting upright, but with bowed head. Thomas seemed to have been charged with agitation enough for the whole family. He walked nervously about the floor till he felt that justice to his tale demanded a higher plane, where shoes could not offend, and then betook himself to the counter, and later to the beam which supported the roof, and made a sort of cats and rats attic under the thatch. All condoled with the old man, and not one but regretted that their supply of cheap good wine was exhausted. The old man offered no explanation, though he had about concluded in his own mind that, as no one knew the secret, he must have in some way poured the bit of amber into a customer's jug. But who possessed the jug he could not surmise, nor could he think of any way of reclaiming it. He talked the matter over carefully and fully to himself at night, and the dog and cat listened attentively, winking knowingly at each other and puzzling their brains much as to what was to be done and how they were to assist their kind old friend. At last the old man fell asleep, and then sitting down face to face by his side, the dog and cat began a discussion. "I am sure," says the cat, "that I can detect that thing if I only come within smelling distance of it. But how do we know where to look for it?" That was a puzzler, but the dog proposed that they make a search through every house in the neighborhood. "We can go on a mere 구경, look-see, you know, and while you call on the cats indoors and keep your smellers open, I will 얘기, chat with the dogs outside, and if you smell anything, you can tell me." The plan seemed to be the only good one, and it was adopted that very night. They were not cast down because the first search was unsuccessful, and continued their work night after night. Sometimes their calls were not appreciated, and in a few cases they had to clear the field by battle before they could go on with the search. No house was neglected, however, and in due time they had done the whole neighborhood, but with no success. They then determined that it must have been carried to the other side of the river, to which place they decided to extend their search as soon as the water was frozen over, so that they could cross on the ice, for they knew they would not be allowed in the crowded ferry boats. And while the dog could swim, he knew that the water was too icy for that. As it soon grew very cold, the river froze so solidly that bull carts, ponies, and all passed over on the ice, and so it remained for near 2 months, allowing the searching party to return each morning to their poor old master, who seemed completely broken up by his loss, and did not venture away from his door except to buy the few provisions which his little fund of savings would allow. Time flew by without bringing success to the faithful comrades, and the old man began to think they too were deserting him, as his old customers had done. It was nearing the time for the spring thaw and the freshet, when one night as the cat was chasing around over the roof timbers in a house away to the outside of the settlement across the river, he detected an odor that caused him to stop so suddenly as to nearly precipitate himself upon a sleeping man on the floor below. He carefully traced up the odor and found that it came from a soapstone tobacco box that sat upon the top of a high clothes press nearby. The box was dusty with neglect, and Thomas concluded that the possessor had accidentally turned the coveted gem, for it was from that the odor came, out into his wine bowl, and, not knowing its nature, had put it into this stone box rather than throw it away. The lid was so securely fastened that the box seemed to be one solid piece, and in despair of opening it, the cat went out to consult the superior wisdom of the dog and see what could be done. "I can't get up there," said the dog, "nor can you bring me the box, or I might break it." "I cannot move the thing, or I might push it off and let it fall to the floor and break," said the cat. So after explaining the things they could not do, the dog finally hit upon a plan they might perhaps successfully carry out. "I will tell you," said he. "You go and see the chief of the Rat Guild in this neighborhood. Tell him that if he will help you in this matter, we will both let him alone for 10 years and not hurt even a mouse of them." But what good is that going to do? Why, don't you see that stone is no harder than some wood, and they can take turns at it till they gnaw a hole through. Then we can easily get the gem." The cat bowed before the marvelous judgment of the dog and went off to accomplish the somewhat difficult task of obtaining an interview with the master rat. Meanwhile, the dog wagged his ears and tail and strode about with a swinging stride, in imitation of the great yangban, or official, who occasionally walked past his master's door, and who seemed to denote by his haughty gait his superiority to other men. His importance made him impudent, and when the cat returned, to his dismay, he found his friend engaged in a genuine fight with a lot of curs who had dared to intrude upon his period of self-congratulation. Thomas mounted the nearest wall and howled so lustily that the inmates of the house, awakened by the uproar, came out and dispersed the contestants. The cat had found the rat, who, upon being assured of safety, came to the mouth of his hole and listened attentively to the proposition. It is needless to say he accepted it, and a contract was made forthwith. It was arranged that work was to begin at once and be continued by relays as long as they could work undisturbed, and when the box was perforated, the cat was to be summoned. The ice had now broken up, and the pair could not return home very easily, so they waited about the neighborhood for some months, picking up a scant living and making many friends and not a few enemies, for they were a proud pair and ready to fight on provocation. It was warm weather when, one night, the cat almost forgot his compact as he saw a big fat rat slinking along towards him. He crouched low and dug his long claws into the earth, while every nerve seemed on the jump, but before he was ready to spring upon his prey, he fortunately remembered his contract. It was just in time, too, for as the rat was none other than the other party to the contract, such a mistake at that time would have been fatal to their object. The rat announced that the hole was completed, but was so small at the inside end that they were at a loss to know how to get the gem out unless the cat could reach it with his paw. Having acquainted the dog with the good news, the cat hurried off to see for himself. He could introduce his paw, but as the object was at the other end of the box, he could not quite reach it. They were in a dilemma and were about to give up, when the cat went again to consult with the dog. The latter promptly told them to put a mouse into the box and let him bring out the gem. They did so, but the hole was too small for the little fellow and his load to get out at the same time, so that much pushing and pulling had to be done before they were successful. They got it safely at last, however, and gave it at once to the dog for safekeeping. Then, with much purring and wagging of tails, the contract of friendship was again renewed, and the strange party broke up. The rats to go and jubilate over their safety, the dog and cat to carry the good news to their mourning master. Again, canine wisdom was called into play in devising a means for crossing the river. The now happy dog was equal to such a trifling thing as this, however, and instructed the cat that he must take the gem in his mouth, hold it well between his teeth, and then mount his, the dog's, back, where he could hold on firmly to the long hair of his neck while he swam across the river. This was agreed upon, and arriving at the river, they put the plan into execution. All went well until, as they neared the opposite bank, a party of school children chanced to notice them coming, and after their amazement at the strange sight wore away, they burst into uproarious laughter, which increased the more they looked at the absurd sight. They clapped their hands and danced with glee, while some fell on the ground and rolled about in an exhaustion of merriment at seeing a cat astride a dog's back being ferried across the river. The dog was too weary and consequently matter of fact to see much fun in it, but the cat shook his sides till his agitation caused the dog to take in great gulps of water in attempting to keep his head up. This but increased the cat's merriment, till he broke out in a laugh as hearty as that of the children, and in doing so dropped the precious gem into the water. The dog, seeing the sad accident, dove at once for the gem, regardless of the cat, who could not let go in time to escape, and was dragged down under the water. Sticking his claws into the dog's skin, in his agony of suffocation, he caused him so much pain that he missed the object of his search and came to the surface. The cat got ashore in some way, greatly angered at the dog's rude conduct. The latter, however, cared little for that, and as soon as he had shaken the water from his hide, he made a lunge at his unlucky companion, who had lost the results of a half-year's faithful work in one moment of foolishness. Dripping like a drowned cat, Thomas was, however, able to climb a tree, and there he stayed till the sun had dried the water from his fur, and he had spat the water from his inwards in the constant spitting he kept up at his now enemy, who kept barking ferociously about the tree below. The cat knew that the dog was dangerous when aroused, and was careful not to descend from his perch till the coast was clear, though at one time he really feared the ugly boys would knock him off with stones as they passed. Once down, he has ever since been careful to avoid the dog, with whom he has never patched up the quarrel. Nor does he wish to do so, for the very sight of a dog causes him to recall that horrible cold-looking and day spent up a tree, and involuntarily he spits as though still filled with river water, and his tail blows up as it had never learned to do till the day when for so long its damp and draggled condition would not permit of its assuming the haughty shape. This accounts for the scarcity of cats and the popularity of dogs. The dog did not give up his efforts even now. He dove many times in vain, and spent most of the following days sitting on the river's bank, apparently lost in thought. Thus the winter found him, his two chief aims apparently being to find the gem and to kill the cat. The latter kept well out of his way, and the ice now covered the place where the former lay hidden. One day he espied a man spearing fish through a hole in the ice, as was very common. Having a natural desire to be around where anything eatable was being displayed, and feeling a sort of proprietorship in the particular part of the river where the man was fishing, and where he himself had had such a sad experience, he went down and looked on. As a fish came up, something natural seemed to greet his nostrils, and then, as the man laid down his catch, the dog grabbed it and rushed off in the greatest haste. He ran with all his might to his master, who, poor man, was now at the end of his string. Coin in Korea is perforated and strung on a string, and was almost reduced to begging. He was therefore delighted when his faithful old friend brought him so acceptable a present as a fresh fish. He at once commenced dressing it, but when he slit it open, to his infinite joy, his long-lost gem fell out of the fish's belly. The dog was too happy to contain himself, but jumping upon his master, he licked him with his tongue, and struck him with his paws, barking meanwhile as though he had again treed the cat. As soon as their joy had become somewhat natural, the old man carefully placed the gem in his trunk, from which he took the last money he had, together with some fine clothes, relics of his more fortunate days. He had feared he must soon pawn these clothes, and had even shown them to the brokers. But now he took them out to put them on, as his fortune had returned to him. Leaving the fish baking on the coals, he donned his fine clothes, and taking his last money, he went and purchased wine for his feast and for a beginning, for he knew that once he placed the gem back in the jug, the supply of wine would not cease. On his return, he and the good dog made a happy feast of the generous fish, and the old man completely recovered his spirits when he had quaffed deeply of the familiar liquid to which his mouth was now such a stranger. Going to his trunk directly, he found to his amazement that it contained another suit of clothes exactly like the first ones he had removed, while there lay also a broken string of cash of just the amount which he had previously taken out. Sitting down to think, the whole truth dawned upon him, and he then saw how he had abused his privilege before in being content to use his talisman simply to run a wine shop, while he might have had money and everything else in abundance by simply giving the charm a chance to work. Acting upon this principle, the old man eventually became immensely wealthy, for he could always duplicate anything with his piece of amber. He carefully tended his faithful dog, who never in his remaining days molested a rat, and never lost an opportunity to attack every cat he saw. End of The Enchanted Wine Jug, or Why the Cat and Dog Are Enemies, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. Shoes for Hats, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Susan Kay. Many centuries ago, when Korea was named Joseon, or the Land of Morning Splendor, the island kingdom out in the eastern sea where the sun rises was called the Land of the Dragonfly, which some foolish people call the Devil's Darning Needle, because its body is so slender, its wings so wide, and its eyes so big. The Koreans call these islanders dwarfs because they were not tall of stature, though they were very warlike and brave. The Isle men had no books or letters, and were very rude in their manners. Therefore, many kind teachers filled with the spirit of great Buddha crossed the sea from everlasting Great Korea to teach these islanders politeness and how to read and write, and to build pagodas and temples and schools. This is the reason why these islanders, who had no storybooks or writing before the coming of the Korean teachers, have no ancient history of what happened long, long ago when Korea was a great country. So the grandmothers in the islands used to tell their children the good old fairy tales, which many elderly people know by heart and can relate without reading, thinking that the kings and queens they talked about were real people when they were only dreams. The islanders called their country the land where the day begins, and there are many fairies in these islands, some good, some bad. So today, these island people make pictures in books and plays on the stage and movies about these Koreans. They get up tableaux and pageants to tell how first the fairies and the king's servants from these far-off islands long ago came to Korea. They wanted to learn politeness, how to make and wear the proper kind of clothes, and how to draw and paint, how to make pictures, how to build houses, how to dance and sing, and make music and play on instruments, how to teach and have schools. For the good fairies always liked to do pretty things. Yet, instead of being grateful for what they had received from Korea, there was one of these island people, a famous woman, who was envious because she lived in a poor land while the Koreans had a rich and beautiful country. Instead of swamps and grassy plains with plenty of wild beasts and birds, and only a few people, poor and miserable, Korea was rich in rice fields and orchards full of fruit. Flowers grew in plenty. Birds, deer, and rabbits were numerous in the mountains, and the scenery was beautiful. In the warm waters, millions of fat fish swam and were easily caught, so the people had plenty of food to eat. Down along the bottom of the sea were most lovely water plants of rich colors, yellow, purple, green, and white, with seaweeds, corals, and sponges. In some of the sea caves lurked the giant crabs, cuttlefish, and every sort of marine monster. Still farther down below, deeper than any line could fathom, dwelt the dragon king of the world under the sea, and his queen, with genii and dragons, and all her attendant maidens. These made sweet music, and here amid the mermaids the fairies had a happy time. These islanders had priests who went down by the seaside when the tide was low. There they called on the spirits of the deep to grant them a safe voyage, good luck, victory over the Koreans, and safe return. There they stood and watched the rippling waves as the breezes blew over the sea. The first living thing that poked its nose above the waters was the guardian of the seashore and the tides, called the saltwater giant. He came up with his head all covered with clam and oyster shells, seaweed, shrimps, and whatever grows in the sand or bottom of the ocean. He had to push aside hundreds of white jellyfish that bumped against him, as the clumsy old chap made his way up to the surface and then waded to the shore. Now this giant fairy was a grumpy sort of a fellow, and seeing the queen and her soldiers, he growled out, "What do you want?" Very politely the queen's messenger made a soft answer to the big fellow and begged him to announce to his master, the dragon king of the world under the sea, that the queen wished him to help her. Would he please order all the great fish and every sea monster to go ahead and pull her ship forward? Would he also present her with the 2 sparkling tide jewels which govern the ebb and the flood tides? If he would do so, then in the one case her enemies might be overwhelmed. In the other case, the ships of the Koreans would be left high and dry on the shore. Then she could march through the country and get all the gold and gems and furs and jewels and clothes and nice things to eat and bring them back to her own country. With the tide jewels in her hand, she could certainly conquer. "And if you please, one thing more," added the messenger. "What else do you want?" growled the saltwater giant. "Have your master, the Dragon King, give our queen power to capture many hundreds of the Korean artists, craftsmen, teachers, and men of book and letters. We shall make these men prisoners and bring them to our country and be civilized." "And what will you do in return to me and my master for all this?" roared the saltwater giant. His voice was like a booming cannon, for he was as mad as fire. "As soon as we get back safely to these shores, our queen will build a temple in honor of the Dragon King. We shall burn incense to him, and our people will pay him our devotions." "Well, then, what else?" roared the saltwater giant. "There will be a shrine also dedicated to you, my lord, and we'll get the best Korean artists to decorate it in wave patterns with drops of foam." The saltwater giant bowed and disappeared with a tremendous splash. Down, down, down he went to report to his master, the Dragon King of the world under the sea. It was necessary for the dignity of His Majesty that the Queen and her soldiers should wait until flood tide, for the Dragon King never appeared except at high water. So the Queen's servant launched her ship and waded out on the waves for the answer they hoped to get. No sooner did the tide mark on the sea beach show that the waves had reached the highest point of flood tide than the sea opened. The white foam curled round the Queen's ship, while all on board held their breath to see what was coming. They knew they would soon behold a sight to make them shiver, for the great deep was mightily stirred. First rose into view a terrible dragon's head on the helmet of the king. It had eyes that seemed to flash fire. Then His Majesty appeared. In a great seashell as big as a bushel and held in both hands, he had the 2 tide jewels. These he presented to the Queen and then quickly disappeared beneath the waves. The last thing they saw was the dragon's head, which, besides the 2 eyes like lightning, had teeth that could bite a boat in half, even when full of men. This monster could swallow down the whole crew in his mouth, that was as wide as a man eating sharks. His enormously long black mustaches were as stout as ship's cables. Immediately after receiving the tide jewels, the Queen of the barbarians landed on the southern coast of Korea. After a few weeks, having fought many battles with the Koreans, she made them bring to her their gold, jewels, furs, fans, rice, and pretty things. She and her people cared nothing about slaves or common prisoners, but whenever and wherever they could find a painter, an artist, a costumer, a maker of pottery, or a man of books, or a priest, they seized and took him along. They carried over with them to the island a great treasure of gems, gold, ornaments, and pretty clothes. They also took away many seeds of flowers and fruit trees, such as lemons, oranges, apples, and pears. In the islands to which they came, these smart men of skill and knowledge from Korea taught the islanders, who had lived like gypsies or Indians, how to build houses, palaces, and temples, to make fine clothes, to paint pictures, and to be like the Koreans and Chinese, who knew all about these things. So the islands became rich in fruit, rice, grain, pagodas, and temples. After this, the island people wore lovely clothes and had fine manners. Now the islanders were great borrowers. They invented very few things themselves, but depended on their neighbors for much of what they had. So they filled both their heads and pockets from what they had brought from Korea. but they often made funny mistakes. When they wanted to learn about fine manners and fine clothes, they asked what, on solemn occasions and in time of ceremony, they should put on their heads. The Koreans were greatly offended at these savages from over the sea for invading their country and taking away their artists and craftsmen. So they now resolved to play a trick on the islanders. So when men from the isles in the ocean sent a company of men to Korea and asked for caps to put on their heads and be shown how to do things properly, the Koreans in contempt gave them their old shoes, which had strings on them to tie over their feet. But the islanders, who loved to go about with little clothing on their backs and usually went barefoot, did not know what these shoes were. They thought these were some kind of headgear, hats or bonnets. So they put them on their heads like skull caps and tied them with the white strings down under their chins. These were like tapes and held the caps on around their necks. So to this day the islanders, when making offerings to the fairies, wear this headgear and think their shoe caps are very fine. End of Shoes for Hats in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14.
The Fairies of Merlin's Crag in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This is read by Shelley Lowe. The Fairies of Merlin's Crag from the Scottish Fairy Book by Elizabeth W. Grierson. About 200 years ago, there was a poor man working as a laborer on a farm in Lanarkshire. He was what was known as an oroman. That is, he had no special work mapped out for him to do, but was expected to undertake odd jobs of any kind that happened to come up. One day his master sent him out to cast peats on a piece of moorland that lay on a certain part of the farm. Now this strip of moorland ran up at one end to a curiously shaped crag, known as Merlin's Crag, because, so the country folk said, that famous enchanter had once taken up his abode there. The man obeyed, and being a willing fellow, when he arrived at the moor, he set to work with all his might and main. He had lifted quite a quantity of peat from near the crag, when he was startled by the appearance of the very smallest woman he had ever seen in his life. She was only about 2 feet high, and she was dressed in a green gown and red stockings, and her long yellow hair was not bound by any ribbon, but hung loosely around her shoulders. She was such a dainty creature that the astonished countryman stopped working, stuck his spade in the ground, and gazed at her in wonder. His wonder increased when she held up one of her tiny fingers and addressed him in these words: "What wouldst thou think if I were to send my husband to uncover thy house? You mortals think that you can do aught that pleaseth you." Then stamping her tiny foot, she added in a voice of command, "Put back that turf instantly, or thou shalt rue this day." Now the poor man had often heard of the fairy folk, and of the harm that they could work to unthinking mortals who offended them. So in fear and trembling he set to work to undo all his labor, and to place every divot in the exact spot from which he had taken it. When he was finished, he looked around for his strange visitor, but she had vanished completely. He could not tell how nor where. Putting up his spade, he wended his way homeward, and going straight to his master, he told him the whole story, and suggested that in future the peats should be taken from the other end of the moor. But the master only laughed. He was a strong, hardy man, and had no belief in ghosts or elves or fairies, or any other creature that he could not see. But although he laughed, he was vexed that his servant should believe in such things. So to cure him, as he thought, of his superstition, he ordered him to take a horse and cart and go back at once and lift all the peats and bring them to dry in the farmsteading. The poor man obeyed with much reluctance. He was greatly relieved, as weeks went on, to find that in spite of his having done so, no harm befell him. In fact, he began to think that his master was right, and that the whole thing must have been a dream. So matters went smoothly. Winter passed, and spring and summer, until autumn came round once more, and the very day arrived on which the peat had been lifted the year before. That day, as the sun went down, the Oraman left the farm to go home to his cottage, and as his master was pleased with him because he had been working very hard lately, he had given him a little can of milk as a present to carry home to his wife. So he was feeling very happy, and as he walked along he was humming a tune to himself. His road took him by the foot of Merlin's Crag, and as he approached it he was astonished to find himself growing strangely tired. His eyelids dropped over his eyes as if he were going to sleep, and his feet grew as heavy as lead. "I will sit down and take a rest for a few minutes," he said to himself. "The road home never seemed so long as it does today." So he sat down on a tuft of grass right under the shadow of the crag, and before he knew where he was he had fallen into a deep and heavy slumber. When he woke it was near midnight, and the moon had risen on the crag, and he rubbed his eyes, when by its soft light he became aware of a large band of fairies, who were dancing around and round him, singing and laughing, pointing their tiny fingers at him, and shaking their wee fists in his face. The bewildered man rose and tried to walk away from them, but turn in whichever direction he would, the fairies accompanied him, encircling him in a magic ring, out of which he could in no wise go. At last they stopped, and with shrieks of elfin laughter led the prettiest and daintiest of their companions up to him, and cried, tread a measure, O man, then wilt thou not be so eager to escape from our company." Now the poor labourer was but a clumsy dancer, and he held back with a shamefaced air. But the fairy who had been chosen to be his partner reached up and seized his hands, and lo! some strange magic seemed to enter into his veins, for in a moment he found himself waltzing and whirling and sliding and bowing, as if he had done nothing else but dance all his life. And the strangest thing of all, he forgot about his home and his children, and he felt so happy that he had no longer the slightest desire to leave the fairies' company. All night long the merriment went on. The little folk danced and danced as if they were mad, and the farm man danced with them, until at last a shrill sound came over the moor. It was the cock from the farmyard crowing its loudest to welcome the dawn. In an instant the revelry ceased, and the fairies, with cries of alarm, crowded together and rushed toward the crag, dragging the countryman along in their midst. As they reached the rock, a mysterious door, which he had never remembered having seen before, opened in it of its own accord, and shut again with a crash as soon as the fairy host had all trooped through. The door led into a large, dimly lighted hall full of tiny couches, and here the little folk sank to rest, tired from all their exertions, while the good man sat on a piece of rock in the corner, wondering what would happen next. But there seemed to be some kind of spell thrown over his senses, for even when the fairies awoke and began to go about their household occupations, and to carry out certain curious practices which he had never seen before, and which, as you will hear, was forbidden to speak of afterwards, he was content to sit and watch them, without any way of attempting to escape. As it drew toward evening, someone touched his elbow, and he turned round with a start to see the little woman with the green dress and scarlet stockings, who had remonstrated with him for lifting the turf the year before, standing by his side. "The divots which thou tookest from the roof of my house have grown once more," she said, "and once more it is covered with grass, so thou canst go home again, for justice is satisfied. Thy punishment hath lasted long enough, but first thou must take thy solemn oath never to tell mortal ears what thou hast seen whilst thou hast dwelt among us." The countryman promised gladly, and took the oath with all due solemnity. Then the door was opened, and he was at liberty to depart. His can of milk was standing on the green, just where he had lain it down when he had went to sleep, and it seemed to him as if it were only yesternight when the farmer had given it to him. But when he reached his home, he was speedily undeceived, for his wife looked at him as if he were a ghost, and the children whom he had left wee, toddling things, were now well-grown boys and girls, who stared at him as if he had been an utter stranger. "Where hast thou been these long, long years?" cried his wife, when she had gathered her wits, and seen that it was really he, and not a spirit. "And how couldst thou find it in thy heart to leave the bairns and me alone?" And then he knew that the one day he had passed in fairyland had lasted 7 whole years, and he realized how heavy the punishment had been which the wee folk had lain upon him. End of The Fairies of Merlin's Crag in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. Read by Shelley Lowe, Oklahoma City, January 29th, 2022.
The Lord and the Silver Bow in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Robert Tunick. Old Greek Stories by James Baldwin. The Lord of the Silver Bow. Section 1. Delos. Long before you or I or anybody else can remember, there lived with the mighty folk on the mountain top a fair and gentle lady named Leto. So fair and gentle was she that Jupiter loved her and made her his wife. But when Juno, the queen of earth and sky, heard of this, she was very angry, and she drove Leto down from the mountain and bade all things great and small refuse to help her. So Leto fled like a wild deer from land to land, and could find no place in which to rest. She could not stop, for then the ground would quake under her feet, and the stones would cry out, "Go on! Go on!" And the birds and beasts and trees and men would join in the cry, and no one in the wide land took pity on her. One day she came to the sea, and as she fled along the beach, she lifted up her hands and called aloud to the great Neptune to help her. Neptune, the king of the sea, heard her and was kind to her. He sent a huge fish called the dolphin to bear her away from the cruel land, and the fish, with Leto sitting on its broad back, swam through the waves to Delos, a little island which lay floating on top of the water like a boat. There the gentle lady found rest and a home, for the place belonged to Neptune, and the words of cruel Juno were not obeyed there. Neptune put 4 marble pillars under the island so that she could rest firm upon them, and he chained it fast with great chains which reached the bottom of the sea, so that the waves might never move it. By and by twin babies were born to Leto in Delos. One was a boy whom she called Apollo, the other a girl whom she named Artemis or Diana. When the news of their birth was carried to Jupiter and the mighty folk on the mountain top, all the world was glad. The sun danced on the waters, and singing swans flew 7 times round the island of Delos. The moon stopped to kiss the babes in their cradle, and Juno forgot her anger, and bade all things on the earth and in the sky be kind to Leto. The 2 children grew very fast. Apollo became tall and strong and graceful. His face was as bright as the sunbeams, and he carried joy and gladness with him wherever he went. Jupiter gave him a pair of swans and a golden chariot, which bore him over sea and land wherever he wanted to go. And he gave him a lyre on which he played the sweetest music that was ever heard, and a silver bow with sharp arrows which never missed the mark. When Apollo went out into the world, and men came to know about him, he was called by some the bringer of light, and by others the master of song, and by still others the Lord of the Silver Bow. Diana was tall and graceful too, and very handsome. She liked to wander in the woods with her maids, who were called nymphs. She took kind care of the timid deer and the helpless creatures which live among the trees, and she was delighted in hunting wolves and bears and other savage beasts. She was loved and feared in every land, and Jupiter made her the queen of the green woods and the chase. Section 2. Delphi. Where is the center of the world? This is a question someone asked Jupiter as he sat in his golden hall. Of course, the mighty ruler of earth and sky was too wise to be puzzled by so simple a thing. But he was too busy to answer it at once. So he said, "Come again in 1 year from today, and I will show you the very place." Then Jupiter took 2 swift eagles, which could fly faster than the storm wind, and trained them till the speed of one was the same as that of the other. At the end of the year he said to his servants, "Take this eagle to the eastern rim of the earth, where the sun rises out of the sea, and carry his fellow to the far west, where the ocean is lost in the darkness, and nothing lies beyond. Then, when I give you the sign, loosen both at the same moment." The servants did as they were bidden, and carried the eagles to the outermost edges of the world. Then Jupiter clapped his hands, the lightning flashed, the thunder rolled, and 2 swift birds were set free. One of them flew straight back towards the west, and the other flew straight back towards the east, and no arrow ever sped faster from the bow than did those 2 birds from the hands of those who had held them. On and on they went like shooting stars, rushing to meet each other, and Jupiter and all his mighty company sat amid the clouds and watched their flight. Nearer and nearer they came, but they swerved not to the right nor to the left. Nearer and nearer, and then, with a crash, like the meeting of 2 ships at sea, the eagles came together in mid-air and fell to the ground. "Who asked where is the center of the world?" said Jupiter. "The spot where the 2 eagles lie, that is the center of the world." They had fallen on the top of a mountain in Greece, which men ever since called Parnassus. "If that is the center of the world," said young Apollo, "then I will make my home there, and I will build a house in that place, so that my light may be seen in all lands." So Apollo went down to Parnassus, and looked about for a spot in which to lay the foundation for his house. The mountain itself was savage and wild, and the valley below it was lonely and dark. The few people who lived there kept themselves hidden among the rocks, as if in dread of some great danger. They told Apollo that near the foot of the mountain, where the steep cliff seemed to be split in 2, there lived a huge serpent called the Python. This serpent often seized sheep and cattle, and sometimes even men and women and children, and carried them up to his dreadful den and devoured them. "Can no one kill this beast?" said Apollo. And they said, "No one. And we, and our children, and our flocks shall all be slain by him." Then Apollo, with his silver bow in his hands, went up towards the place where the Python lay. The monster had worn great paths through the grass and among the rocks, and his lair was not hard to find. When he caught sight of Apollo, he uncoiled himself, and came out to meet him. The bright prince saw the creature's glaring eyes and blood-red mouth, and heard the rush of his scaly body over the stones. He fitted an arrow to his bow, and stood still. The Python saw that his foe was no common man, and turned to flee. Then the arrow sped from the bow, and the monster was dead. "Here I will build my house," said Apollo. Close to the foot of the steep cliff, and beneath the spot where Jupiter's eagles had fallen, he laid the foundations, and soon, where had been the lair of the Python, the white walls of Apollo's temple arose among the rocks. Then the poor people of the land came and built their houses nearby, and Apollo lived among them many years, and taught them to be gentle and wise, and showed them how to be happy. The mountain was no longer savage and wild, but was a place of music and song. The valley was no longer dark and lonely, but was filled with beauty and light. "What shall we call our city?" the people asked. "Call it Delphi, or Dolphin," said Apollo, "for it was the dolphin that carried my mother across the sea." Section 3. Daphne. In the Vale of Tempe, which lies far north of Delphi, there lived a young girl whose name was Daphne. She was a strange child, wild and shy as a fawn, and as fleet of foot as the deer that feed on the plains. But she was as fair and as good as a day in June, and no one could know her but to love her. Daphne spent the most of her time in the fields and woods, with the birds and blossoms and trees, and she liked best of all to wander along the banks of the river Peneus, and listen to the ripple of the water as it flowed among the reeds and over the shining pebbles. Very often she would sing and talk to the river as if it were a living thing and could hear her, and she fancied that it understood what she said, and that it whispered many a wonderful secret to her in return. The good people who knew her best said, "She is a child of the river." "Yes, dear river," she said, "let me be your child." The river smiled, and answered her in a way which she alone could understand, and always, After that, she called it Father Peneus. One day, when the sun shone warm and the air was filled with the perfume of flowers, Daphne wandered farther away from the river than she had ever gone before. She passed through a shady wood and climbed a hill, from the top of which she could see Father Peneus lying white and clear and smiling in the valley below. Beyond her were other hills, and then the green slopes and wooden top of great Mount Ossa. Ah, if she could only climb to the summit of Ossa, she might have a view of the sea and of other mountains close by, and of the twin peaks of Mount Parnassus, far, far to the south. "Goodbye, Father Peneus," she said. "I'm going to climb the mountains, but I will come back soon." The river smiled, and Daphne ran onward, climbing one hill after another, and wondering why the great mountains seemed still so far away. By and by she came to the foot of a wooden slope, where there was a pretty waterfall, and the ground was bespangled with thousands of beautiful flowers, and she sat down there a moment to rest. Then, from the grove of the hilltop above her, came the sound of the loveliest music she had ever heard. She stood up and listened. Someone was playing on a lyre, and someone was singing. She was frightened, and still the music was so charming that she could not run away. Then, all at once, the sound ceased, and a young man, tall and fair, and with a face as bright as the morning sun, came down the hillside toward her. "Daphne!" he said, but she did not stop to hear. She turned and fled like a frightened deer, back towards the Vale of Tempe. "Daphne!" cried the young man. She did not know that it was Apollo, the lord of the silver bow. She only knew that the stranger was following her, and she ran as fast as her fleet feet could carry her. No young man had ever spoken to her before, and the sound of his voice filled her heart with fear. "She is the fairest maiden that I ever saw," said Apollo to himself. "If I could only look at her face again, and speak with her, how happy I should be." Through brake, through briar, over rocks and the trunks of fallen trees, down rugged slopes, across mountain streams, leaping, flying, panting, Daphne ran. She looked not once behind her, but she heard the swift footsteps of Apollo coming always nearer. She heard the rattle of the silver bow, which hung from his shoulders. She heard his very breath. He was so close to her. At last she was in the valley where the ground was smooth, and it was easier running, but her strength was fast leaving her. Right before her, however, lay the river, white and smiling in the sunlight. She stretched out her arms and cried, "Oh, Father Peneus, save me!" Then it seemed as though the river rose up to meet her. The air was filled with a blinding mist. For a moment, Apollo lost sight of the fleeing maiden. Then he saw her close by the river's bank, and so near to him that her long hair, streaming behind her, brushed his cheek. He thought she was about to leap into the rushing, roaring waters, and he reached out his hand to save her. But it was not the fair, timid Daphne that he caught in his arms. It was the trunk of a laurel tree, its green leaves trembling in the breeze. "Oh, Daphne, Daphne!" he cried. "Is this the way in which the river saves you? Does Father Peneus turn you into a tree to keep you from me?" Whether Daphne had really turned into a tree, I know not, nor does it matter now, it was so long ago. But Apollo believed that it was so, and hence he made a wreath of laurel leaves and set it on his head like a crown, and said that he would wear it always in memory of the lovely maiden. And ever after that, the laurel was Apollo's favorite tree, and even to this day, poets and musicians are crowned with its leaves. Section 4. Deluded. Apollo did not care to live much of the time with his mighty kinfolk on the mountaintop. He liked better to go about from place to place and from land to land, seeing people at their work and making their lives happy. When men first saw his fair boyish face and soft white hands, they sneered and said he was only an idle, good-for-nothing fellow. But when they heard him speak, they were so charmed that they stood spellbound to listen. And ever after that they made his words their law. They wondered how it was that he was so wise, for it seemed to them that he did nothing but stroll about, playing on his wonderful lyre, and looking at the trees and blossoms and birds and bees. But when any of them were sick, they came to him, and he told them what to find in plants, or stones, or brooks, that would heal them and make them strong again. They noticed that he did not grow old, as others did, but that he was always young and fair, and even after he had gone away, they knew not how, nor whither. It seemed as though the earth were a brighter and sweeter place to live in, than it had been before his coming. In a mountain village beyond the Vale of Tempe, there lived a beautiful lady named Coronis. When Apollo saw her, he loved her and made her his wife, and for a long time the two lived together, and were happy. By and by, a babe was born to them, a boy with the most wonderful eyes that anyone ever saw, and they named him Asclepius. Then the mountains and the woods were filled with the music of Apollo's lyre, and even the mighty folk on the mountain top were glad. One day Apollo left Coronis and her child, and went on a journey to visit his favorite home on Mount Parnassus. "I shall hear from you every day," he said at parting. "The crow will fly swiftly every morning to Parnassus, and tell me whether you and the child are well, and what you are doing while I am away." For Apollo had a pet crow, which was very wise, and could talk. The bird was not black, like the crows which you have seen, but as white as snow. Men say that all crows were white until that time, but I doubt whether anyone knows. Apollo's crow was a great tattler, and did not always tell the truth. It would see the beginning of something, and then, without waiting to know anything more about it, would hurry off and make up a great story about it. But there was no one else to carry news from Coronis to Apollo, for, as you know, there were no postmen in those days, and there was no telegraph wire in the whole world. All went well for several days. Every morning the white bird would wing its way over hills and plains, and rivers and forests, until it found Apollo, either in the groves on top of Parnassus, or in his house at Delphi. Then it would alight upon his shoulder and say, "Coronis is well! Coronis is well!" One day, however, it had a different story. It came much earlier than before, and seemed to be in a great haste. "Cor, cor, cor!" it cried, but it was so out of breath that it could not speak her whole name. "What is the matter?" cried Apollo in alarm. "Has anything happened to Coronis? Speak! Tell me the truth." "She does not love you! She does not love you!" cried the crow. "I saw a man! I saw a man!" And then, without stopping to take a breath or to finish the story, it flew up into the air and hurried homeward again. Apollo, who had always been so wise, was now almost as foolish as his crow. He fancied that Coronis had really deserted him for another man, and his mind was filled with grief and rage. With his silver bow in his hands, he started at once for his home. He did not stop to speak with anyone. He had made up his mind to learn the truth for himself. His swan team and his golden chariot were not at hand, for now that he was living with men, he must travel like men. The journey had to be made on foot, and it was no short journey in those days when there were no roads. But after a time he came to the village where he had lived happily for so many years, and soon he saw his own house half hidden among the dark-leaved olive trees. In another moment he would know whether the crow had told him the truth. He heard the footsteps of someone running in the grove. He caught a glimpse of a white robe among the trees. He felt sure that this was a man whom the crow had seen, and he was trying to run away. He fitted an arrow to his bow quickly. He drew the string. Twang! And the arrow, which never missed, sped like a flash of light through the air. Apollo heard a sharp, wild cry of pain, and he bounded forward through the grove. There, stretched dying on the grass, he saw his dear Coronis. She had seen him coming, and was running gladly to greet him when the cruel arrow pierced her heart. Apollo was overcome with grief. He took her form in his arms, and cried to call her back to life again. But it was all in vain. She could only whisper his name, and then she was dead. A moment afterwards the crow alighted on the trees nearby. "Cor! Cor! Cor!" it began, and it wanted now to finish its story, but Apollo bade it begone. "Cursed bird!" he cried. "You shall never say a word but cor, 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 all your life. And the feathers, which you are so proud, shall no longer be white, but black as midnight." And from that time to this, as you very well know, all crows have been black, and they fly from one dead tree to another, always crying, "Cor! Cor! Cor!" Section 5. Disgraced. Soon after this, Apollo took the little Asclepius in his arms, and carried him to a wise old schoolmaster named Charon, who lived in a cave under the gray cliffs of a mountain close by the sea. "Take this child," he said, "and teach him all the lore of the mountains, the woods, and the fields. Teach him those things in which he needs to know in order to do great good to his fellow men." And Asclepius proved to be a wise child, gentle and sweet and teachable, and among all the pupils of Cheiron was the best loved. He learned the lore of the mountains and the woods and the fields. He found out what virtue there is in herbs and flowers and senseless stones, and he studied the habits of birds and beasts and men. But above all, he became skillful in dressing wounds and healing diseases. And to this day, physicians remember and honor him as the first and greatest of their craft. When he grew up to manhood, his name was heard in every land, and people blessed him because he was the friend of life and the foe of death. As time went by, Asclepius cured so many people and saved so many lives that Pluto, the pale-faced king of the lower world, became alarmed. "I shall soon have nothing to do," he said, "if this physician does not stop keeping people away from my kingdom." And he sent word to his brother Jupiter, and complained that Asclepius was cheating him out of what was his due. Great Jupiter listened to his complaint, and stood up among the storm clouds, and hurled his thunderbolts at Asclepius, until the great physician was cruelly slain. Then all the world was filled with grief, and even the beasts, and the trees, and the stones wept, because the friend of life was no more. When Apollo heard of the death of his son, his grief and wrath were terrible. He could not do anything against Jupiter and Pluto, for they were stronger than he. But he went down into the smithy of Vulcan, underneath the smoky mountains, and slew the giant smiths who had made the deadly thunderbolts. Then Jupiter, in his turn, was angry, and ordered Apollo to come before him and be punished for what he had done. He took away his bow and arrows, and his wonderful lyre, and all his beauty of form and feature. And after that, Jupiter clothed him in the rags of a beggar, and drove him down from the mountain, and told him that he should never come back, nor be himself again, until he had served some man a whole year as a slave. And so Apollo went out, alone and friendless, into the world, and no one who saw him would have dreamt that he was once the sun-bright lord of the silver bow. End of The Lord of the Silver Bow in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. Read by Robert Tunick.
The King's Hairs in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bethany Rook. The King's Hairs by Clara Strobe. Translated by Frederick H. Martins. Once upon a time, there was a man who lived in a little back room. He had given up his estate to the heir, but in addition he had 3 sons, who were named Peter, Paul, and Esben, who was the youngest. All 3 hung around at home and would not work, for they had it too easy, and they thought themselves too good for anything like work, and nothing was good enough for them. Finally, Peter once heard that the king wanted a shepherd for his hares, and he told his father he would apply for the position, as it would just suit him, seeing that he wished to serve no one lower in rank than the king. His father, it is true, was of the opinion that there might be other work that would suit him better, for whoever was to herd hares would have to be quick and spry, and not a sleepyhead, and when the hares took to their heels in all directions, it was a dance of another kind than when one skipped about a room. But it was of no use. Peter insisted, and would have his own way, took his knapsack, and shambled downhill. After he had gone a while, he saw an old woman who had got her nose wedged in a tree stump while chopping wood, and when Peter saw her jerking and pulling away, trying to get out, he burst into loud laughter. "Don't stand there and laugh in such a stupid way," said the woman, "but come and help a poor, feeble old woman. I wanted to split up some firewood, and caught my nose here, and here I have been standing for more than 100 years, pulling and jerking, without a bit of bread to chew in all that time," said she. Then Peter had to laugh all the harder. He found it all very amusing, and said that if she had already been standing there 100 years, then she could probably hold out for another 100 years or more. When he came to court, they at once took him on as a herdsman. The place was not bad. There was good food and good wages, and the chance of winning the princess besides. Yet if no more than a single one of the king's hairs were to be lost, they would cut 3 red strips from his back and throw him into the snake pit. As long as Peter was on the common or in the enclosure, he kept his hairs together nicely, but later, when they reached the forest, they ran away from him across the hills. Peter ran after them with tremendous leaps, as long as he thought he could catch even a single hair. But when the very last one had vanished, his breath was gone, and he saw no more of them. Toward noon he went home, taking his time about it, and when he reached the enclosure, he looked around for them on all sides, but no hares came. And then when he came to the castle, there stood the king with a knife in his hand. He cut 3 red strips from his back and cast him into the snake pit. After a while, Paul decided to go to the castle and herd the king's hares. His father told him what he had told Peter, and more besides. But he insisted on going, and would not listen, and he fared neither better nor worse than Peter had. The old woman stood and pulled and jerked at her nose in the tree trunk, and he laughed, found it very amusing, and let her stand there and torment herself. He was at once taken into service, but the hares all ran away across the hills, though he pursued them, and worked away like a shepherd dog in the sun. And when he came back to the castle in the evening, minus his hares, there stood the king with the knife in his hand, cut 3 broad strips from his back, rubbed in pepper and salt, and flung him into the snake pit. Then, after some time had passed, the youngest decided to set out to herd the king's hares, and told his father of his intention. He thought that would be just the work for him, to loaf about in forest and field, look for strawberry patches, herd a flock of hares, and lie down and sleep in the sun between times. His father thought that there was other work that would suit him better, and that even if he fared no worse than his brothers, it was quite certain that he would fare no better. Whoever herded the king's hares must not drag along as though he had lead in his soles, or like a fly on a lime rod, and that when the hares took to their heels, it was a horse of another color from catching fleas with gloved hands. Whoever wanted to escape with a whole back would have to be more than quick and nimble, and swifter than a bird. But there was nothing he could do. Esben merely kept on saying that he wanted to go to court and serve the king, for he would not take service with any lesser master, said he, and he would see to the hares. They could not be much worse than a herd of goats or of calves. And with that he took his knapsack and strolled comfortably down the hill. After he had wandered a while, and began to feel a proper hunger, he came to the old woman who was wedged by the nose in the tree trunk and who was pulling and jerking away in order to get loose. "Good day, mother," said Esben. "And why are you worrying yourself so with your nose, you poor thing?" "No one has called me mother for the last 100 years," said the old woman. "But come and help me out, and give me a bite to eat, for I have not had a bit to eat in all that time, and I will do something for your sake as well," said she. "Yes, no doubt she would need something to eat and drink badly," said Esben. Then he hewed the tree trunk apart, so that she got her nose out of the cleft, sat down to eat, and shared with her. The old woman had a good appetite, and she received a good half of his provisions. When they were through, she gave Esben a whistle which had the power that if he blew into one end, whatever he wished was scattered to all the winds, and when he blew into the other, all came together again. And if the whistle passed from his possession, it would return as soon as he wished it back. "That is a wonderful whistle," thought Esben. When he came to the castle, they at once took him on as a shepherd. The place was not bad. He was to have food and wages, and should he manage to herd the king's hares without losing one of them, he might possibly win the princess. But if he lost so much as a single hair, and no matter how small it might be, then they would cut 3 red strips from his back. And the king was so sure of his case that he went right off to whet his knife. It would be a simple matter to herd the hares, thought Esben, for when they went off they were as obedient as a herd of sheep. And so long as they were on the common and in the enclosure, they even marched in rank and file. But when they reached the forest, and noontime came, and the sun burned down on hill and dale, they all took to their heels and ran away across the hills. "Hello there! "So you want to run away?" called Esben, and blew into one end of his whistle, and then they scattered the more quickly to all the ends of the earth. But when he had reached an old charcoal pit, he blew into the other end of his whistle, and before he knew it, the hares were back again, and standing in rank and file so he could review them, just like a regiment of soldiers on the drill ground. "That is a splendid whistle," thought Esben, lay down on a sunny hillock, and fell asleep. The hares were left to their own devices, and played until evening. Then he once more whistled them together, and took them along to the castle like a herd of sheep. The king and queen, and the princess too, stood in the hallway, and wondered what sort of a fellow this was, who could herd hares without losing a single one. The king reckoned and added them up, and counted with his fingers, and then added them up again, but not even the teeny weeniest hare was missing. "He is quite a chap, he is," said the princess. The following day he again went to the forest and herded his hares, but while he lay in all comfort beside a strawberry patch, they sent out the chambermaid from the castle to him, and she was to find out how he managed to herd the king's hares. He showed her his whistle, and blew into one end, and all the hares darted away across the hills in all directions, and then he blew into the other, and they came trotting up from all sides, and once more stood in rank and file. "That is a wonderful whistle," said the chambermaid. She would gladly give him $100 if he cared to sell it. "Yes, it is a splendid whistle," said Esben, "and I will not sell it for money. But if you give me $100, and a kiss with every dollar to boot, then I might let you have it." Yes, indeed, that would suit her right down to the ground. She would gladly give him 2 kisses with every dollar, and feel grateful besides. So she got the whistle, but when she reached the castle, the whistle disappeared all of a sudden. Esben had wished it back again, and toward evening he came along, driving his hares like a herd of sheep. The king reckoned and counted and added, but all to no purpose, for not the least little hare was missing. When Esben was herding his hares the 3rd day, they sent the princess to him to get away his pipe from him. She was tickled to death, and finally offered him $200 if he would let her have the whistle, and would also tell her what she had to do in order to fetch it safely home with her. "Yes, it is a very valuable whistle," said Esben, "and I will not sell it." But at last, as a favor to her, he said he would let her have it if she gave him $200, and a kiss for every dollar to boot. But if she wanted to keep it, why, she must take good care of it, for that was her affair. "That is a very high price for a hair whistle," said the princess, and she really shrank from kissing him. "But since we are here in the middle of the forest, where no one can see or hear us, I'll let it pass, for I positively must have the whistle," said she. And when Esben had pocketed the price agreed upon, she received the whistle, and held it tightly clutched in her hand all the way home. Yet when she reached the castle, and wanted to show it, it disappeared out of her hands. On the following day the queen herself set out, and she felt quite sure that she would succeed in coaxing the whistle away from him. She was stingier, and only offered $50, but she had to raise her bid until she reached 300. Esben said it was a magnificent whistle, and that the price was a beggarly one, but seeing that she was the queen, he would let it pass. She was to pay him $300, and for every dollar she was to give him a buss to boot. Then she should have the whistle, and he was paid in full as agreed, since as regards the busses the queen was not so stingy. When she had the whistle in her hands, she tied it fast and hid it well, but she fared not a whit better than either of the others. When she wanted to show the whistle, it was gone, and in the evening Esben came home, driving his hares as though they were a well-trained flock of sheep. "You are stupid, woman," said the king. "I suppose I will have to go to him myself if we really are to obtain this trumpery whistle. There seems to be nothing else left to do." And the following day, when Esben was once more herding his hares, the king followed him, and found him at the same place where the woman had bargained with him. They soon became good friends, and Esben showed him the whistle, and blew into one end and the other, and the king thought the whistle very pretty, and finally insisted on buying it, even though it cost him $1,000. "Yes, it is a magnificent whistle," said Esben, "and I would not sell it for money. But do you see that white mare over yonder?" said he, and pointed into the forest. "Yes, she belongs to me. That is my Snow Witch," cried the king, for he knew her very well. "Well, if you will give me $1,000 and kiss the white mare that is grazing on the moor by the big pine to boot, then you can have my whistle," said Esben. "Is that the only price at which you will sell?" asked the king. "Yes," said Esben. "But at least may I not put a silken handkerchief between?" asked the king. This was conceded him, and thus he obtained the whistle. He put it in the purse in his pocket, and carefully buttoned up the pocket. Yet when he reached the castle, and wanted to take it out, he was in the same case as the women, for he no longer had the whistle. And in the evening Esben came home with his herd of hares, and not the least little hair was missing. The king was angry and furious because he had made a fool of them all, and had swindled the king's self out of the whistle into the bargain, and now he wanted to do away with Esben. The queen was of the same opinion, and said it was best to behead such a knave when he was caught in the act. Esben thought this neither fair nor just, for he had only done what he had been asked to do, and had defended himself as best he knew how. But the king said that this made no difference to him, yet if Esben could manage to fill the big brewing cauldron till it ran over, he would spare his life. The job would be neither long nor hard, said Esben. He thought he could warrant that, and he began to tell about the old woman with her nose in the tree trunk, and in between he said, I must make up plenty of stories to fill the cauldron. And then he told of the whistle, and the chambermaid who came to him and wanted to buy the whistle for $100, and about all the kisses that she had had to give him to boot, up on the hillock by the forest. And then he told about the princess, how she had come and kissed him so sweetly for the whistle's sake, because no one could see or hear it in the forest. I must make up plenty of stories in order to fill the cauldron, said Esben. Then he told of the queen, and of how stingy she had been with her money, and how liberal with her busses. For I must make up plenty of stories in order to fill the cauldron, said Esben. But I think it must be full now, said the queen. Oh no, not a sign of it, said the king. Then Esben began to tell how the king had come to him, and about the white mare who was grazing on the moor. And since he insisted on having the whistle, he had to, well, with all due respect, I have to make up plenty of stories in order to fill the cauldron, said Esben. Stop, it is full, fellow, cried the king. Can't you see that it is running over? The king and the queen were of the opinion that it would be best for Esben to receive the princess and half the kingdom. There did not seem anything else to do. Yes, it was a magnificent whistle, said Esben. End of The King's Hares in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14.
The Fate of the Children of Lear. From Gods and Fighting Men in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Michael O'Kelly. The Fate of the Children of Lear. Now at the time when the Tuatha De Danann chose a king for themselves, after the battle of Chalchin, and Lear heard the kingship was given to Boab Jarrig, it did not please him, and he left the gathering without leave, and with no word to anyone, for he thought it was he himself had a right to be made king. But if he went away himself, Boab was given the kingship none the less, for not one of the five begrudged it to him, but only Lear. And it is what they determined to follow after Lear, and to burn down his house, and to attack himself with spear and sword, on account of his not giving obedience to the king they had chosen. We will not do that, said Boab Jarrig, for that man would defend any place he's in, and besides that, he said, I am none the less king over the Tuatha De Danann, although he does not submit to me. All went on like that for a good while, but at last a great misfortune came on Lear, for his wife died from him after a sickness of 3 nights, and that came very hard on Lear, and there was heaviness on his mind after her, and there was great talk of the death of that woman in her own time. And the news of it was told all through Ireland, and it came to the house of Baub, and the best of the men of Jah were with him at the time. And Baub said, "If Lear had a mind for it, my help and my friendship would be good for him now, since his wife is not living to him. For I have here with me the 3 young girls of the best shape and the best appearance and the best name in all Ireland, Eve, Aoife and Alva, the 3 daughters of Ailill of Aaron, my own 3 nurslings." The men of Jah said then it was a good thought he had, and that what he said was true. Messages and messengers were sent then from Baub Jarrig to the place where Lear was, to say that if he had a mind to join with the son of the Dagda, and to acknowledge his lordship, he would give him a foster child of his foster children. And Lear thought well of the offer, and he set out on the morrow with 50 chariots from Shí Fiannachi, and he went by every short way till he came to Baub's dwelling place at Loch Jarrig. And there was a welcome before him there, and all the people were merry and pleasant before him, and he and his people got good attendance that night. And the 3 daughters of Ailill of Aaron were sitting on the one seat with Baub Jarrig's wife, the queen of the Tuatha De Danann, that was their foster mother. And Baub said, "You may have your choice of the 3 young girls, Lear." "I cannot say," said Lear, "which one of them is my choice, but whichever of them is the eldest, she is the noblest, and it is best for me to take her." "If that is so," said Baub, "it's Eve is the eldest, and she will be given to you, if it is your wish." "It is my wish," he said. And he took Eve for his wife that night, and he stopped there for a fortnight, and then he brought her away to his own house, till he would make a great wedding feast. And in the course of the time, Eve brought forth 2 children, a daughter and a son. Fionnuala and Ea their names were. And after a while she was brought to bed again, and this time she gave birth to 2 sons, and they called them Fiachra and Con. And she herself died at their birth, and that weighed very heavy on Lear, and only for the way his mind was set on his 4 children he would have gone near to die of grief. The news came to Baub Jarrig's place, and all the people gave out 3 loud high cries, keening their nursling. And after they had keened her, it is what Baub Jarrig said, "It is a fret to us, our daughter to have died, for her own sake and for the sake of the good man we gave her to, for we are thankful for his friendship and his faithfulness. However," he said, "our friendship with another will not be broken, for I will give him for a wife her sister Aoife." When Lear heard that, he came for the girl and married her and brought her home to his house. There was honour and affection with Aoife for her sister's children, and indeed no person at all could see those 4 children without giving them their heart's love. And Baub Jarrig used often to be going to Lear's house for the sake of those children, and he used to bring them to his own place for a good length of time, and then he would let them go back to their own place again. And the men of Jah were at that time using the Feast of Age in every hill of the Shí in turn, and when they came to Lear's hill, those 4 children were their joy and delight, for the beauty of their appearance, and it is where they used to sleep in beds in sight of their father Lear, and he used to rise up at the break of every morning and to lie down among his children. But it is what came of all this that a fire of jealousy was kindled in Aoife, and she got to have a dislike and a hatred of her sister's children. Then she let on to have a sickness that lasted through nearly the length of a year, and at the end of that time she did a deed of jealousy and cruel treachery against the children of Lear. And one day she got her chariot yoked, and she took the 4 children in it, and they went forward towards the house of Baobjareg. But Fionnuala had no mind to go with her, for she knew by her she had some plan for their death or their destruction, and she had seen in a dream that there was treachery against them in Aoife's mind. But all the same, she was not able to escape from what was before her. And when they were on their way, Aoife said to her people, "Let you kill now," she said, "the 4 children of Lear, for whose sake their father has given up my love, and I will give you your own choice of reward out of all the good things of the world." "We will not do that, indeed," said they. "It is a bad deed you have thought of, and harm will come to you out of it." And when they would not do as she bade them, she took out a sword herself to put an end to the children with. But she being a woman, and with no good courage, and with no great strength in her mind, she was not able to do it. They went on then west to Loch Jarlavrach, the Lake of the Oaks, and the horses were stopped there. And Aoife bade the children of Lear to go out and bathe in the lake, and they did as she bade them. And as soon as Aoife saw them out in the lake, she struck them with a druid rod, and put on them the shape of 4 swans, white and beautiful. And it is what she said, "Out with you, children of the king, your luck is taken away from you for ever. It is sorrowful the story will be to your friends. It is with flocks of birds your cries will be heard for ever." And Fionnuala said, "Witch, we know now what your name is. You have struck us down with no hope of relief, but although you put us from wave to wave, there are times when we will touch the land. We shall get help when we are seen, help and all that is best for us, even though we have to sleep upon the lake. It is our minds will be going abroad early." And then the 4 children of Lear turned towards Aoife, and it is what Fionnuala said, "It is a bad deed you have done, Aoife, and it is a bad fulfilling of friendship, you to destroy us without cause. And vengeance for it will come to you, and you will fall in satisfaction for it. For your power for our destruction is not greater than the power of our friends to avenge it on you. And put some bounds now," she said, "to the time this enchantment is to stop on us. And it is worse for you to have asked it of me. And the bounds I set to your time are this, till the woman from the south and the man from the north will come together. And since you ask to hear it of me," she said, "no friends and no power that you have will be able to bring you out of these shapes you are in through the length of your lives, until you have seen 300 years on Loch Jarlavrach, and 300 years on Shortnuela between Ireland and Alban, and 300 years at Irisdomnan and Inishglura. And these are to be your journeys from this out," she said. But then repentance came on Aoife, and she said, "Since there is no other help for me to give you now, you may keep your own speech, and you will be singing sweet music of the Sidhe that will put the men of the earth to sleep, and there will be no music in the world to equal to it. And your own sense and your own nobility will stay with you, the way it will not weigh so heavy on you to be in the shape of birds. And go away out of my sight now, children of Lear," she said, "with your white faces, with your stammering Irish. It is a great curse on tender lads, they to be driven out on the rough wind. 900 years to be on the water. It is a long time for anyone to be in pain. It is I put this on you through treachery. It is best for you to do as I tell you now. Lear, that got victory with so many a good cast, his heart is a kernel of death in him now. The groaning of the great hero is a sickness to me, though it is I that have well earned his anger." Then the horses were caught for Aoife, and the chariot yoked for her, and she went on to the palace of Baobjareg. And there was welcome before her from the chief people of the place. And the son of the Dagda asked her why she did not bring the children of Lear with her. "I will tell you that," she said. "It is because Lear has no liking for you, and he will not trust you with his children, for fear you might keep them from him altogether." "I wonder at that," said Bab Jarrig, "for those children are dearer to me than my own children." And he thought in his own mind it was deceit the woman was doing on him. And it was what he did. He sent messengers to the north, to Shi Fiachi. And Lear asked them, what did they come for? "On the head of your children," said they. "Are they not gone to you along with Aoife?" he said. "They are not," said they. "And Aoife said it was yourself who would not let them come." It is downhearted and sorrowful Lear was at that news, for he understood well it was Aoife had destroyed or made an end of his children. And early in the morning of the morrow his horses were caught, and he set out on the road to the southwest. And when he was as far as the shore of Loch Jarabruch, the 4 children saw the horses coming towards them, and it is what Fionnuala said, "A welcome to the troop of horses I see coming near to the lake. The people they are bringing are strong. There is sadness on them. It is us they are following. It is for us they are looking. Let us move over to the shore, Fiacre and Cumley Con. Those that are coming can be no others in the world but only Lear and his household." Then Lear came to the edge of the lake, and he took notice of the swans having the voice of living people, and he asked them why it was that they had that voice. "I'll tell you that, Lear," said Fionnuala. "We are your own 4 children that are after being destroyed by your wife and by the sister of our own mother, through the dint of her jealousy." "Is there any way to put you into your own shapes again?" said Lear. "There is no way," said Fionnuala, "for all the men of the world could not help us till we have gone through our time, and that will not be," she said, "till the end of 900 years." When Lear and his people heard that, they gave out 3 great heavy shouts of grief and sorrow and crying. "Is there a mind with you," said Lear, "to come to us on the land, since you have your own sense and your memory yet?" "We have not the power," said Fionnuala, "to live with any person at all from this time. But we have our own language, the Irish, and we have the power to sing sweet music, and it is enough to satisfy the whole race of men to be listening to that music. And let you stop here tonight," she said, "and we will be making music for you." So Lear and his people stopped there, listening to the music of the swans, and they slept there quietly that night. And Lear rose up early on the morning of the morrow, and he made this complaint: "It is time to go out from this place. I do not sleep, though I am in my lying down. To be parted from my dear children, it is that is tormenting my heart. It is a bad net I put over you, bringing Aoife, daughter of Eliel of Aaron, to the house. I would never have followed that advice if I had known what it would bring upon me. O Fionnuala and Cumley Con, O Fiacre of the beautiful arms, it is not ready I am to go away from you, from the border of the harbour where you are." Then Lear went on to the palace of Bab Jarrig, and there was a welcome before him there, and he got a reproach from Bab Jarrig for not bringing his children along with him. "My grief," said Lear, "it is not I that would not bring my children along with me. It was Aoife there beyond, your own foster child, and the sister of their mother, that put them in the shape of 4 white swans on Loch Jarabruch, in the sight of the whole of the men of Ireland. But they have their sense with them yet, and their reason, and their voice, and they're Irish." Bab Jarrig gave a great start when he heard that, and he knew what Lear said was true, and he gave a very sharp reproach to Aoife, and he said, "This treachery will be worse for yourself in the end, Aoife, than to the children of Lear. And what shape would you yourself think worst of being in?" he said. "I would think worst of being a witch of the air," she said. "It is into that shape I will put you now," said Bab, and with that he struck her with a druid wand, and she was turned into a witch of the air there and then, and she went away on the wind in that shape, and she is in it yet, and will be in it for the end of life and time. As to Boab Jarrig and the Tuatha De Danann, they came to the shore of Loch Darabruch, and they made their camp there, to be listening to the music of the swans. And the sons of the Gael used to be coming no less than the men of Jah to hear them from every part of Ireland, for there never was any music or any delight heard in Ireland compared with that music of the swans. And they used to be telling stories, and to be talking with the men of Ireland every day, and with their teachers, and their fellow pupils, and their friends. And every night they used to sing very sweet music of the Sidhe, and everyone that heard that music would sleep sound and quiet, whatever trouble or long sickness might be on him. For everyone that heard the music of the birds, it is happy and contented he would be after it. These two gatherings now of the Tuatha De Danann and the sons of the Gael stopped there round Loch Darabruch to the length of 300 years. And it is then Fionnuala said to her brothers, "Do you know," she said, "we have spent all we have to spend of our time here, but this one night only." And there was great sorrow on the sons of Lear when they heard that, for they thought it the same as to be living people again, to be talking with their friends and their companions on Loch Darabruch, in comparison with going on the cold, fretful sea of the Moyle in the north. And they came early on the morrow to speak with their father and with their foster father, and they bade them farewell. And Fionnuala made this complaint: "Farewell to you, Boab Jarrig, the man with whom all knowledge is in pledge, and farewell to our father along with you, Lear of the Hill of the White Field. The time is come, as I think, for us to part from you, O pleasant company. My grief, it is not on a visit we are going to you. From this day out, O friends of our heart, our comrades, it is on the tormented course of the Moyle we will be, without the voice of any person near us. 300 years there, and 300 years in the bay of the men of Dumnam. It is a pity for the four comely children of Lear, the salt waves of the sea to be their covering by night. O three brothers, with the ruddy faces gone from you, let them all leave the lake now, the great troop that loved us. It is sorrowful our parting is." After that complaint they took to flight, lightly, airily, till they came to Shotnamuila, between Ireland and Alban, and that was a grief to the men of Ireland. And they gave out an order no swan was to be killed from that out, whatever chance there might be of killing one, all through Ireland. It was a bad dwelling place for the children of Lear, they to be on Shotnamuila. When they saw the wide coast about them, they were filled with cold and with sorrow, and they thought nothing of all they had gone through before, in comparison to what they were going through on that sea. Now one night, while they were there, a great storm came upon them, and it is what Fionnuala said. "My dear brothers," she said, "it is a pity for us not to be making ready for this night, for it is certain the storm will separate us from one another. And let us," she said, "settle on some place where we can meet afterwards, if we are driven from one another in the night." "Let us settle," said the others, "to meet one another at Carrignaron, the Rock of the Seals, for we all have knowledge of it." And when midnight came, the wind came on them with it, and the noise of the waves increased, and the lightning was flashing, and a rough storm came sweeping down, the way the children of Lear were scattered over the great sea, and the wideness of it set them astray, so that no one of them could know which way the others went. But after that storm a great quiet came on the sea, and Fionnuala was alone on Shotnamuila. And when she took notice that her brothers were wanting, she was lamenting after them greatly, and she made this complaint: "It is a pity for me to be alive in the state I am. It is frozen to my sides, my wings are. It is little that the wind has not broken my heart and my body with the loss of A. To be 300 years on Loch Dorabruch without going into my own shape, it is worse to me the time I am on Shrutnamuile. The three I loved, the three I loved, that slept under the shelter of my feathers, till the dead come back to the living I will see them no more for ever. It is a pity I to stay after Fiacre, and after A, and after Cumley Con, and with no account of them. My grief I to be here to face every hardship this night. She stopped all night there upon the Rock of the Seals until the rising of the sun, looking out over the sea on every side, till at last she saw Con coming to her, his feathers wet through, and his head hanging, and her heart gave him a great welcome. And then Fiacre came, wet and perished and worn out, and he could not say a word they could understand, with the dint of the cold and the hardship he had gone through. And Fionnuala put him under her wings, and she said, "We would be well off now if A would but come to us." It was not long after that they saw A coming, his head dry and his feathers beautiful, and Fionnuala gave him a great welcome, and she put him in under the feathers of her breast, and Fiacre under her right wing, and Con under her left wing, the way she could put her feathers over them all. "And my brothers," she said, "this was a bad night to us, and it is many of its like are before us from this out." They stayed there a long time after that, suffering cold and misery on the Moyle, till at last a night came on them they had never known the like of before, for frost and snow and wind and cold. They were crying and lamenting the hardship of their life, and the cold of the night, and the greatness of the snow, and the hardness of the wind. And after they had suffered cold to the end of a year, a worse night again came on them, in the middle of winter. And they were on Carrignaron, and the water froze about them, and as they rested on the rock, their feet and their wings and their feathers froze to the rock, the way they were not able to move from it. And they made such a hard struggle to get away, that they left the skin of their feet, and their feathers, and the tops of their wings on the rock after them. "My grief, children of Lear," said Fionnuala, "it is bad our state is now, for we cannot bear the salt water to touch us, and there are bonds on us not to leave it. And if the salt water goes into our sores," she said, "we will get our death." And she made this complaint: "It is keening we are tonight, without feathers to cover our bodies. It is cold the rough, uneven rocks are under our bare feet. It is bad our stepmother was to us the time she played enchantments on us, sending us out like swans upon the sea. Our washing place is on the ridge of the bay, in the foam of flying mains of the sea. Our share of the ale feast is the salt water of the blue tide. 1 daughter and 3 sons. It is in the clefts of the rocks we are. It is on the hard rocks we are. It is a pity the way we are." However, they came on to the course of the Moyle again, and the salt water was sharp and rough and bitter to them, but if it was itself, they were not able to avoid it, or to get shelter from it. They were there by the shore, under that hardship, till such time as their feathers grew again, and their wings, and till their sores were entirely healed. And then they used to go every day to the shore of Ireland, or of Alban, but they had to come back to Shrutnamuile every night. Now they came one day to the mouth of the Banna, to the north of Ireland, and they saw a troop of riders, beautiful, of the one colour, with well-trained, pure white horses under them, and they travelling the road straight from the south-west. "Do you know who those riders are, sons of Lear?" said Fionnuala. "We do not," they said, "but it is likely they might be some troop of the sons of the Gael, or of the Tuatha De Danann." They moved over closer to the shore then, that they might know who they were, and when the riders saw them, they came to meet them, until they were able to hold talk together. And the chief men among them were 2 sons of Boab Jarrig, Achisach of the quick wits, and Fergus Fichilach of the chess, and a third part of the riders of the Sidhe along with them, and it was for the swans they had been looking for a long while before that, and when they came together they wished one another a kind and loving welcome. And the children of Lear asked for news of all the men of Jah, and above all of Lear and Boab Jarrig and their people. They are well, and they are in the one place together, said they, in your father's house at Sidhe Fiannacha, using the feast of age pleasantly and happily, and with no uneasiness on them, only for being without yourselves, and without knowledge of what happened to you from the day you left Loch Jarbrach. That has not been the way with us, said Fionnuala, for we have gone through great hardship and uneasiness and misery on the tides of the sea until this day. And she made this complaint. There is a delight tonight with the household of Lear, plenty of ale with them, and of wine, although it is in a cold dwelling place this night are the 4 children of the king. It is without a spot our bedclothes are, our bodies covered over with curved feathers, but it is often we were dressed in purple, and we drinking pleasant mead. It is what our food is, and our drink, the white sand and the bitter water of the sea. It is often we drank mead of hazelnuts from round 4-lipped drinking cups. It is what our beds are, bare rocks out of the power of the waves. It is often they used to be spread out for us, beds of the breast feathers of birds. Though it is our work now to be swimming through the frost and through the noise of the waves, it is often a company of the sons of kings were riding after us to the hill of Baub. It is what wasted my strength to be going and coming over the current of the Muil the way I never was used to, and never to be in the sunshine and the soft grass. Fiacre's bread and Con's bed is to come under the cover of my wings on the sea. Ea has his place under the feathers of my breast, the 4 of us side by side. The teaching of Manannán without deceit, the talk of Boab Jarrig on the pleasant ridge, the voice of Angus, his sweet kisses, it is by their side I used to be without grief. After that the riders went on to Lear's house, and they told the chief men of the Tuatha De Danann all the birds had gone through, and the state they were in. We have no power over them, the chief men said, but we are glad they are living yet, for they will get help in the end of time. As to the children of Lear, they went back toward their old place on the Muil, and they stopped there till the time they had to spend in it was spent. And then Fionnuala said, the time has come for us to leave this place, and it is to Iris Domnann that we must go now, she said, after our 300 years here. And indeed there will be no rest for us there, or any standing ground, or any shelter from the storms. But since it is time for us to go, let us set out on the cold wind, the way we will not go astray. So they set out in that way, and left Shrut na Mile behind them, and went to the point of Iris Domnann, and there they stopped. And it is a life of misery and a cold life they led there. And one time the sea froze about them, that they could not move at all, and the brothers were lamenting, and Fionnuala was comforting them, for she knew there would help come to them in the end. And they stayed at Iris Domnann till the time they had to spend there was spent. And then Fionnuala said, the time has come for us to go back to Sidhe Fiannacha, where our father is with his household, and with all our own people. It pleases us well to hear that, they said. So they set out flying through the air lightly till they came to Sidhe Fiannacha. And it is how they found the place empty before them, and nothing in it but green hillocks and thickets of nettles, without a house, without a fire, without a hearthstone. And the 4 pressed close to one another then, and they gave out 3 sorrowful cries, and Fionnuala made this complaint. It is a wonder to me this place is, and it without a house, without a dwelling place, To see it the way it is now, ochone, it is bitterness to my heart. Without dogs, without hounds for hunting, without women, without great kings. We never knew it to be like this when our father was in it. Without horns, without cups, without drinking in the lighted house, without young men, without riders. The way it is tonight is a foretelling of sorrow. The people of the place to be as they are now, ochone, it is grief to my heart. It is plain to my mind tonight, the lord of the house is not living. Och, the house where we used to see music and playing and the gathering of people, I think it a great change to see it lonely the way it is tonight. The greatness of the hardships we have gone through, going from one wave to another of the sea, we never heard the like of them coming on any other person. It is seldom this place had its part with grass and bushes. The man is not living that would know us. It would be a wonder to him to see us here. However, the children of Lear stopped that night in their father's place and their grandfather's, where they had been reared, and they were singing very sweet music of the Sidhe. And they rose up early on the morning of the morrow, and went to Inishglura, and all the birds of the country gathered near them on Loch Nanain, the lake of the birds. And they used to go out to feed every day to the far parts of the country, to Inishgeach and Achill, and the place Don, son of Milled, and his people that were drowned were buried, and to all the western islands of Connacht, and they used to go back to Inishglura every night. It was about this time it happened them to meet with a young man of good race, and his name was Ibrich, and he often took notice of the birds, and their singing was sweet to him, and he loved them greatly, and they loved him. And it is this young man that told the whole story of all that had happened to them, and put it in order. And the story he told of what happened to them in the end is this. It was after the faith of Christ and Blessed Patrick came into Ireland that St. Macraevóg came to Inishglura, and the first night he came to the island, the children of Lear heard the voice of his bell ringing near them, and the brothers started up with fright when they heard it. We do not know, they said, what is that weak, unpleasing voice we hear? That is the voice of the bell of Macraevóg, said Fionnuala, and it is through that bell, she said, you will be set free from pain and from misery. They listened to that music of the bell till the matins were done, and then they began to sing the low, sweet music of the Sidhe. And Macraevóg was listening to them, and he prayed to God to show him who was singing that music, and it was showed to him that the children of Lear were singing it. And on the morning of the morrow, he went forward to the lake of the birds, and he saw the swans before him on the lake, and he went down to them at the brink of the shore. Are you the children of Lear? He said. We are indeed, said they. I give thanks to God for that, said he, for it is for your sakes I am come to this island beyond any other island. And let you come to land now, he said, and give your trust to me, that you may do good deeds and part from your sins. They came to the land after that, and they put their trust in Macraevóg, and he brought them to his own dwelling place, and they used to be hearing mass with him. And he got a good smith, and bade him make chains of bright silver for them, and he put a chain between Ea and Fionnuala, and a chain between Con and Fiachra, and the four of them were raising his heart and gladdening his mind, and no danger and no distress that was on the swans before put any trouble on them now. Now the king of Connacht at the time was Lagnan, son of Colman, son of Cohach, and Joch, daughter of Fingon, was his wife. And that was the coming together of the man from the north and the woman from the south that Aoife had spoken of. And the woman heard talk of the birds, and a great desire came on her to get them, and he bade Lagnan to bring them to her, and he said he would ask them of Macraevóg. And she gave her word she would not stop another night with him, unless he would bring them to her. And she set out from the house there and then, and Lardnan sent messengers after her to bring her back, and they did not overtake her till she was at Kildune. She went back home with them then, and Lardnan sent messages to ask the birds of Macuivog, and he did not get them. There was great anger on Lardnan then, and he went himself to the place Macuivog was, and he asked, was it true that he had refused them the birds? It is true indeed, said he. At that Lardnan rose up, and he took hold of the swans, and pulled them off the altar, 2 birds in each hand, to bring them away to Joch. But no sooner had he laid his hand on them, than their bird skins fell off, and what was in their place were 3 lean, withered old men, and a thin, withered old woman, without blood or flesh. And Lardnan gave a great start at that, and he went out from the place. It is then Fionnuala said to Macuivog, come and baptize us now, for it is short till our death comes, and it is certain you do not think worse of parting with us than we do of parting with you. And make our grave afterwards, she said, and lay Con at my right side, and Féachra on my left side, and Ea before my face, between my 2 arms. And pray to the God of heaven, she said, that you may be able to baptize us. The children of Lear were baptized then, and they died and were buried as Fionnuala had desired. Féachra and Con, one at each side of her, and Ea before her face. And a stone was put over them, and their names were written in Ogham, and they were keened there, and heaven was gained for their souls. And that is the fate of the children of Lear so far. End of The Fate of the Children of Lear by Augusta Gregory.
The Children of Odin, read by Medora Sharp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Far, Far Away and Long Ago by Padraig Colum. Once there was another sun and another moon, and a different sun and a different moon from the ones we see now. Sol was the name of the sun, and Mani was the name of the moon. But always behind Sol and Mani wolves went, a wolf behind each. The wolves caught on them at last, and devoured Sol and Mani, and the world was in darkness and cold. In those times the gods lived, Odin, Thor, Hondur, Baldur, Tyr, Heimdall, Vidar, Vali, and as well as Loki, the doer god, the doer of good, and the doer of evil. And the beautiful goddesses were living then, Frigga, Freya, Nani, Udana, and Sif. But in the days when the sun and moon were destroyed, the gods were destroyed too. All the gods except Baldur, who had died before that time. Vidar and Vali, the sons of Odin, and Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor. At that time too, there were men and women in the world. But before the sun and moon were devoured, and before the gods were destroyed, terrible things had happened in the world. Snow fell on the 4 corners of the earth and kept on falling for 3 seasons. Winds came and blew away everything, and the people of the world who had lived on the spite of the snow and cold and winds fought each other, brother killing brother, until all the people were destroyed. Also, there was another earth at that time, and a green and beautiful, but the terrible winds that blew leveled down the forests and hills and dwellings. Then the fire came and burnt the earth. There was a darkness, for the sun and the moon were devoured, and the gods had met with their doom. And the time in which all these things happened was called Ragnarok. the twilight of the gods. And a new sun and a new moon appeared and went traveling through the heavens. They were more lovely than Soleimani, and no wolves followed behind them in chase. The earth became green and beautiful again, and in the deep forest that the fire had not burnt, a woman and man awakened. They had been hiding there by Odin, and left to sleep during the Ragnarok and the twilight of the gods. Lif was a woman, and Lifstarar was a man. They moved through the world, and their children and their children's children made people for the new earth. And of the gods were left Vedir, Vali, and the sons of Odin, and Modi and Magnar, the sons of Thor. On the new earth, Vidar and Vali found tablets that were older than the gods had written on, and had left there for them, tablets telling of what had happened before Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. And the people who lived after Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, were not troubled as the people in the older days were troubled by the terrible beings who had brought destruction upon the world and upon men and women, and who from the beginning had waged war upon the gods.
End of Far Away and Long Ago in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14.
The Story of the Beginning by Mary H. Foster and Mabel H. Cummings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Beginning, read by Medora K. The people who lived long ago in the far-off lands of the north watched the wonderful things that happened out of the doors every day, just as we do. But they did not know about the one living God, who is the Father of all, who made them, and the world, and the rules by which his wise laws. So they thought there must be a great many unseen powers living in the clouds, in the wind, in the storms, and the sunshine, and doing all those wonders that no man could do. And so those northern people, who were their own forefathers, our own forefathers, came to believe in many gods, one for the sun, another for the thunder, another for the flowers, and so on. In the long dark winters, when the bright sun had gone away from them, these Northmen had time to think many thoughts about the powers of the frost and the wind and storms, which they called giants, and they used to tell stories and sing songs about the short bright summers, and the thawing out of the streams and lakes, and the coming of the birds and flowers. With great joy the people saw the bright sun god, Baldur, come back to them in the spring, after the long darknesses, and knew that they owed their lives to his friendly warmth and light. As we read the stories or myths told by those people long ago, we can see that they were meant to tell about the world around us. At first, the stories were told and sung from father to son, that is, from one generation to another. But later, when people learned how to write, these myths were written down and kept with great love and care. This is the story they told of the beginning. At first, before living creatures were in the world, it was all rough and without order. Far to the north it was very cold, for ice and snow were everywhere. Toward the south there was fire, and from the meeting of the fire and the cold a thick vapor was formed, from which sprang a huge giant. Looking about for some food, he saw a cow, who was also searching for something to eat. The ice tasted salt, and when the cow began to lick it, a head appeared, and at the last a whole figure of a god stood before her. From these two, the giant and the god, came to great races of giants and gods, who were always enemies to each other. The giants were constantly trying to break into Asgard, the home of the gods in the sky. The gods, on their other hand, watched and planned to keep out the giants and to drive them back to their own stronghold, Utgard. Our world, where men and women lived, was between Utgard and Asgard. It was called Midgard. And around this Midgard, world under the ocean, was coiled a monstrous serpent, who grew so long that his tail grew down his throat. He was called the Midgard serpent. A wonderful tree named Yggdrasil connected all the worlds. This great ash tree had its roots in Utgard, and the tops of its branches reached so high as to overshadow Asgard. Its three main roots were watered by 3 fountains, and near one of them sat a wise giant Mimir, of whom he shall hear later. The Norns were 3 sisters, also lived at the roots of Yggdrasil, and were careful to see that it was watered every day. Little Gray Squirrel was always running up and down the tree, jerking his tail and hurrying to tell the news to everyone along the way. He was so anxious to be the first one to carry the news that many times he brought trouble to himself and to others because he was not always careful to tell the story just as he had heard it. And often everyone would have been happier if the squirrel had kept the story quite to himself. The gods and goddesses all together were called Æsir, and the chief father of them all was Odin. His lofty throne rose high into the midst of Asgard, the sacred city which the gods had built for their beautiful home. From Asgard, arching over down the lower world, was the rainbow bridge called Bifrost, the trembling bridge. Upon this, the dwellers in Asgard would travel every day, all except the mighty Thor. His thunder chariot was too heavy for the trembling bridge, so he had to go around a longer way. After the gods had made men and women and taught them to dwell on earth, in the world of Midgard, Odin looked forth one morning from his heavenly seat to see what further work was waiting for his helping hand. He noticed far away below him a race of small beings, some of them busy doing mischievous deeds, while others sat idle doing nothing. Odin sent for all these people to come to him, and when they had reached Asgard, they were admitted to his palace of Glacium. They entered the great judgment hall, where they found all Æsir sitting, with Father Odin at their head.
End of the story of the beginning in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14.
The Tiger and the Monkeys in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brianna Childs. The Tiger and the Monkeys by Mrs. Raffi. At the beginning of time, the animals were free and living wild and unruly lives. But there were so many disputes and quarrels that they convened a council to choose a king to reign over them. With one accord, they nominated the tiger to be king, not for any special wisdom or merit which he possessed, but because of his great strength, by which he would be able to subdue the turbulent beasts. Although he possessed greater strength than any of his kindred, the tiger was more ignorant of the ways and habits of his subjects than any of the animals. He was so self-absorbed that he never troubled himself to study the ways of others, and this caused him to act very foolishly at times, and to make himself ridiculous, for the animals were tempted to take advantage of his great ignorance, and to play tricks upon him whenever they thought they could do so undetected. This tale relates how the monkeys played a cunning trick on their king, which caused mortal enmity to spring up between him and them forever. One hot day, the tiger walked abroad to take an airing, but, the sun being so hot, he turned aside to shelter under some leafy trees, and there he fell asleep. Presently he awoke, and, on awaking, he heard coming from overhead very melodious singing, to which he listened enraptured. It was the little insect Shalimon, chirping on a leaf. But she was so small the tiger could not see her, and, being so ignorant, he had no idea whose voice it was. He peered to the branches right and left, trying to discover the singer, but he only saw a company of monkeys at play in the trees. So he began to question them, who it was that was singing above him. Now the monkeys and all the jungle animals were perfectly familiar with the singing of Shalimon, and recognized the voice from afar. They thought it very contemptible in the king to be more ignorant than themselves, and one audacious young monkey, in a spirit of mischief, answered that the singer was their youngest sister. The other monkeys were perturbed when they heard their brother giving such an impudent answer, thinking that the tiger would be offended, and would punish them with his great strength. They were preparing to run away, when, to their amazement, they heard the tiger replying to their rash young brother in a gentle voice, and with most affable manners, and saying to him, "You are my brother-in-law. Your sister has the most beautiful voice in the jungle. I will make her my wife." If the predicament of the monkeys was bad at the beginning, it was doubly so now, for they felt that, things having taken such an unexpected turn, it would be impossible to conceal from the knowledge of the tiger their brother's offense. They determined, however, not to desert the young culprit, and, if possible, to try and rescue him. So they approached the tiger, and with much seeming courtesy and honor they put forward the excuse that their sister was very young, and not yet of marriageable age. This excuse made no impression on the king, for he said, "So much the better. As she is young, I can mold her to my own ways, and bring her up according to my own views, which would not be so easy if she were fully matured." To which the monkeys replied, "Our sister is not amenable to instruction. She is indolent and fond of her own will." The tiger, however, was so lovesick that no argument had weight with him. He thought the brothers were severe in their judgment, and expressed his conviction that she could not be as slothful as they said, for she was foregoing her midday repose for the sake of making music to cheer the animals. He ordered them to come down from the trees, and to lead their sister to him. After this the monkeys feared to argue further, so they pretended to agree to his commands. But they craved a boon from him, and asked for a little time to make preparations, as it would not be becoming for one of such a high degree to join himself with a poor family like theirs without showing him adequate honor, such as was due to his rank. This request the tiger granted, and it was arranged between them that he was to come and claim his bride at the time of the full moon, a week from that day. And so the tiger departed with evident goodwill. As soon as they found themselves alone, the monkeys began to think out some plans by which they could meet the situation and escape exposure. They decided to call together a council of the whole tribe of monkeys, for they well foresaw that the whole tribe would be in peril if the tiger found out what they had done. So the monkeys came to hold a council, and in that council it was decided that they must continue to keep up the duplicity begun, and in order to hoodwink the tiger still further, they planned to make a clay image after the fashion of a woman, and to present her to the tiger as his bride. So they made preparations for a great feast, but they did not invite anybody except their own tribe to attend. During the succeeding days the monkeys busied themselves collecting clay and molding it into an image, which they propped against a tree. They were unable to make the head of one piece with the body, so they molded the head separately, and when it was finished, they placed it loosely on the body of the image. Then they proceeded to dress the image in all the finery they could procure, and they carefully covered the head and face with a veil so as to hide it from the eyes of the bridegroom. The night of the full moon arrived, and all the monkey family were assembled at the appointed place, where, with much clatter and seeming joy, they awaited the arrival of the tiger, though they were really very anxious about the consequences. Everything was in readiness, and the place laid out with many kinds of food, so as to lead the tiger to think that they were sincere in their welcome. He came very early, very gorgeously arrayed, and carrying over his shoulder a net full of betel nut and pan leaves, and was received with loud acclamation by his prospective relatives. But the tiger hardly deigned to give them a greeting, so impatient was he to meet his bride, and he demanded to be taken to her immediately. The monkeys led him with great ceremony to the clay image, but their hearts were beating fast, with fear lest he should discover their fraud. When they reached the image, they said, "This is our sister. Take her, and may she be worthy of the great honor you have conferred upon her." Thereupon they retired to a safe distance. When the tiger saw how finely dressed she was, and how modestly she had veiled herself, he felt a little timid, for she was so much finer than the little gray monkey he had been picturing to himself. He came up to her and said deferentially, as he slung the net of betel nut round her neck, "You are the chief person at this feast. Take the pan and the betel nut, and divide them among the company according to custom." The bride, however, remained motionless and mute. Seeing which, the tiger asked the monkeys in a displeased voice, "Why doth not your sister answer me, nor obey my commands?" "She is very young," they replied. "Perhaps she has fallen asleep while waiting for you. Pull the string of the net, and she will awaken." Upon this the tiger gave the string a sharp tug, and the loose head of the image rolled on to the floor, whereupon the monkeys, uttering the most piercing shrieks, pounced upon the tiger in a mob, declaring he had killed their sister, and that he had only made a pretense of marrying her in order to get a hold of her to kill her. A fierce and bloody fight ensued, in which the tiger was nearly killed, and ever since then the tiger has feared the monkeys, and they are the only animals in the jungle that dare challenge him to fight. He never discovered their duplicity, but he learned one very effective lesson, for he has never committed the indiscretion of proposing marriage with an unknown bride since that unfortunate affair with the monkeys, while the monkeys are rejoicing in the cunning by which they saved their brother and their tribe from punishment. End of The Tiger and the Monkeys in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14.
The Lady of the Fountain in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lady of the Fountain from the Mabinogion, translated by Lady Charlotte Guest. King Arthur was at Caerleon upon Usk, and one day he sat in his chamber, and with him were Owain the son of Urien, and Kynon the son of Clydno, and Kai the son of Kyner, and Gwenhwyvar and her handmaidens at needlework by the window. And if it should be said that there was a porter at Arthur's palace, there was none. Glúluid Gavaelvawr was there, acting as porter, to welcome guests and strangers, and to receive them with honour, and to inform them of the manners and customs of the court, and to direct those who came to the hall or to the presence chamber, and those who came to take up their lodging. In the centre of the chamber King Arthur sat upon a seat of green rushes, over which was spread a covering of flame-coloured satin, and a cushion of red satin was under his elbow. Then Arthur spoke. "If I thought you would not disparage me," said he, "I would sleep a while I wait for my repast, and you can entertain one another with relating tales, and can obtain a flagon of mead and some meat from Kai." And the king went to sleep. And Kynon the son of Clydno asked Kai for that which Arthur had promised them. "I too will have the good tale which he promised to me," said Kai. "Nay," answered Kynon, "fairer will it be for thee to fulfill Arthur's behest in the first place, and then we will tell thee the best tale that we know." So Kai went to the kitchen and to the mead cellar, and returned bearing a flagon of mead and a golden goblet, and a handful of skewers, upon which were broiled collops of meat. Then they ate the collops and began to drink the mead. "Now," said Kai, "it is time for you to give me my story." "Kynon," said Owain, "do thou pay to Kai the tale that is his due." "Truly," said Kynon, "thou art older and art a better teller of tales, and hast seen more marvellous things than I. Do thou therefore pay Kai his tale." "Begin thyself," quoth Owain, "with the best that thou knowest." "I will do so," answered Kynon. "I was the only son of my mother and father, and I was exceedingly aspiring, and my daring was very great. I thought there was no enterprise in the world too mighty for me, and after I had achieved all the adventures that were in my own country, I equipped myself and set forth to journey through deserts and distant regions. And at length it chanced that I came to the fairest valley in the world, wherein were trees of equal growth. And a river ran through the valley, and a path was by the side of the river. And I followed the path until midday, and continued my journey along the remainder of the valley until the evening. And at the extremity of a plain I came to a large and lustrous castle, at the foot of which was a torrent. And I approached the castle, and there I beheld two youths with yellow curling hair, each with a frontlet of gold upon his head, and clad in a garment of yellow satin. And they had gold clasps upon their insteps. In the hand of each of them was an ivory bow, strung with the sinews of the stag, and their arrows had shafts of the bone of the whale, and were winged with peacock's feathers. The shafts also had golden heads, and they had daggers with blades of gold, and with hilts of the bone of the whale, and they were shooting their daggers. And a little way from them I saw a man in the prime of life with his beard newly shorn, clad in a robe and a mantle of yellow satin, and round the top of his mantle was a band of gold lace. On his feet were shoes of variegated leather, fastened by two bosses of gold. When I saw him, I went towards him and saluted him, and such was his courtesy that he no sooner received my greeting than he returned it. And he went with me towards the castle. Now there were no dwellers in the castle except those who were in one hall. And there I saw 24 damsels embroidering satin at a window. And this I tell thee, Kai, that the least fair of them was fairer than the fairest maid thou hast ever beheld in the island of Britain, and the least lovely of them was more lovely than Gwenhwyvar, the wife of Arthur, when she has appeared loveliest at the offering, on the day of Nativity, or at the feast of Easter. They rose up at my coming, and 6 of them took my horse, and divested me of my armor. And 6 others took my arms, and washed them in a vessel until they were perfectly bright. And the third 6 spread cloths upon the tables, and prepared meat. And the fourth 6 took off my soiled garments, and placed others upon me, namely an undervest and a doublet of fine linen, and a robe and a surcoat, and a mantle of yellow satin with a broad gold band upon the mantle. And they placed cushions both beneath and around me, with coverings of red linen, and I sat down. Now the 6 maidens who had taken my horse unharnessed him, as well as if they had been the best squires in the island of Britain. Then, behold, they brought bowls of silver, wherein was water to wash, and towels of linen, some green and some white, and I washed. And in a little while the man sat down to the table, and I sat next to him, and below me sat all the maidens, except those who waited on us. And the table was of silver, and the cloths upon the table were of linen, and no vessel was served upon the table that was not either of gold, or of silver, or of buffalo horn. And our meat was brought to us. And verily, Kai, I saw there every sort of meat and every sort of liquor that I have ever seen elsewhere. But the meat and the liquor were better served there than I have ever seen them in any other place. Until the repast was half over, neither the man nor any one of the damsels spoke a single word to me. But when the man perceived that it would be more agreeable to me to converse than to eat any more, he began to inquire of me who I was. I said I was glad to find that there was someone who would discourse with me, and that it was not considered so great a crime at that court for people to hold converse together. "Chieftain," said the man, "we would have talked to thee sooner, but we feared to disturb thee during thy repast. Now, however, we will discourse." Then I told the man who I was and what was the cause of my journey, and said that I was seeking whether anyone was superior to me, or whether I could gain the mastery over all. The man looked upon me, and he smiled, and said, "If I did not fear to distress thee too much, I would show thee that which thou seekest." Upon this I became anxious and sorrowful, and when the man perceived it, he said, "If thou wouldst rather that I show thee thy disadvantage than thine advantage, I will do so. Sleep here tonight, and in the morning arise early, and take the road upwards through the valley, until thou reachest the wood through which thou camest hither. A little way within the wood thou wilt meet with a road branching off to the right, by which thou must proceed until thou comest to a large sheltered glade with a mound in the centre. And thou wilt see a black man of great stature on the top of the mound. He is not smaller in size than two of the men of this world. He has but 1 foot, and 1 eye in the middle of his forehead. And he has a club of iron, and it is certain that there are no 2 men in the world who would not find their burden in that club. And he is not a comely man, but on the contrary he is exceedingly ill-favoured, and he is the woodward of that wood. And thou wilt see 1,000 wild animals grazing around him. Inquire of him the way out of the glade, and he will reply to thee briefly, and will point out the road by which thou shalt find that which thou art in quest of." And long seemed that night to me, and the next morning I arose and equipped myself, and mounted my horse, and proceeded straight through the valley to the wood. And I followed the cross-road which the man had pointed out to me, till at length I arrived at the glade. And there was I 3 times more astonished at the number of wild animals that I beheld than the man had said I should be. And the black man was there, sitting upon the top of the mound. Huge of stature as the man had told me that he was, I found him to exceed by far the description he had given me of him. As for the iron club which the man had told me was a burden for 2 men, I am certain, Kai, that it would be a heavy weight for 4 warriors to lift. And this was in the black man's hand. And he only spoke to me in answer to my questions. Then I asked him what power he held over those animals. "I will show thee, little man," said he. And he took his club in his hand, and with it he struck a stag a great blow, so that he brayed vehemently. And at his braying the animals came together as numerous as the stars in the sky, so that it was difficult for me to find room in the glade to stand among them. There were serpents and dragons and divers sorts of animals. And he looked at them, and bade them go and feed, and they bowed their heads and did him homage as vassals to their lord. Then the black man said to me, "Seest thou now, little man, what power I hold over these animals?" Then I inquired of him the way, and he became very rough in his manner. However, he asked me whither I would go, and when I told him who I was and what I sought, he directed me. "Take," said he, "that path that leads towards the head of the glade, and ascend the wooded steep until thou comest to its summit, and there thou wilt find an open space, like to a large valley, and in the midst of it a tall tree, whose branches are greener than the greenest pine trees. Under this tree is a fountain, and by the side of the fountain a marble slab, and on the marble slab a silver bowl, attached by a chain of silver, so that it may not be carried away. Take the bowl, and throw a bowlful of water upon the slab, and thou wilt hear a mighty peal of thunder, so that thou wilt think that heaven and earth are trembling with its fury. With the thunder there will come a shower so severe that it will be scarce possible for thee to endure it and live. And the shower will be hailstones, and after the shower the weather will become fair, and every leaf that was upon the tree will have been carried away by the shower. Then a flight of birds will come and alight upon the tree, and in thine own country thou didst never hear a strain so sweet as that which they will sing. And at the moment that thou art most delighted with the song of the birds, thou wilt hear a murmuring and complaining coming towards thee along the valley. And thou wilt see a knight upon a coal-black horse, clothed in black velvet, and with a pennon of black linen upon his lance. And he will ride unto thee to encounter thee with the utmost speed. If thou fleest from him, he will overtake thee. And if thou abidest there, as sure as thou art a mounted knight, he will leave thee on foot. And if thou dost not find trouble in that adventure, thou needest not seek it during the rest of thy life. So I journeyed on until I reached the summit of the steep, and there I found everything as the black man had described it to me. And I went up to the tree, and beneath it I saw the fountain, and by its side the marble slab, and the silver bowl fastened by the chain. Then I took the bowl and cast a bowlful of water upon the slab, and thereupon, behold, the thunder came, much more violent than the black man had led me to expect. And after the thunder came the shower, and of a truth I tell thee, Kai, that there is neither man nor beast that can endure that shower and live. For not one of those hailstones would be stopped, either by the flesh or by the skin, until it had reached the bone. I turned my horse's flank towards the shower, and placed the beak of my shield over his head and neck, while I held the upper part of it over my own head, and thus I withstood the shower. When I looked on the tree, there was not a single leaf upon it, and then the sky became clear, and with that, behold, the birds lighted upon the tree and sang. And truly, Kai, I never heard any melody equal to that, either before or since. And when I was most charmed with listening to the birds, lo, a murmuring voice was heard through the valley approaching me and saying, O knight, what has brought thee hither? What evil have I done to thee, that thou shouldst act towards me and my possessions as thou hast this day? Dost thou not know that the shower today has left in my dominions neither man nor beast alive that was exposed to it? And thereupon, behold, a knight on a black horse appeared, clothed in jet black velvet, and with a tabard of black linen about him. And we charged each other, and as the onset was furious, it was not long before I was overthrown. Then the knight passed the shaft of his lance through the bridle rein on my horse, and rode off with the two horses, leaving me where I was. And he did not even bestow so much notice upon me as to imprison me, nor did he despoil me of my arms. So I returned along the road by which I had come. And when I reached the glade where the black man was, I confess to thee, Kai, it is a marvel that I did not melt down into a liquid pool through the shame that I felt at the black man's derision. And that night I came to the same castle where I had spent the night preceding, and I was more agreeably entertained that night than I had been the night before. And I was better feasted, and I conversed freely with the inmates of the castle, and none of them alluded to my expedition to the fountain, neither did I mention it to any, and I remained there that night. When I arose on the morrow, I found, ready saddled, a dark bay palfrey, with nostrils as red as scarlet. And after putting on my armor and leaving there my blessing, I returned to my own court. And that horse I still possess, and he's in the stable yonder. And I declare that I would not part with him for the best palfrey in the island of Britain. Now, of a truth, Kai, no man ever before confessed to an adventure so much to his own discredit. And verily, it seems strange to me that neither before nor since have I heard of any person besides myself who knew of this adventure, and that the subject of it should exist within King Arthur's dominions, without any other person lighting upon it. Now, quoth Owain, would it not be well to go and endeavour to discover that place? By the hand of my friend, said Kai, often thou dost utter that with thy tongue which thou wouldst not make good with thy deeds. In very truth, said Guenhwyvar, it were better thou were hanged, Kai, than to use such uncourteous speech towards a man like Owain. By the hand of my friend, good lady, said Kai, thy praise of Owain is not greater than mine. With that Arthur awoke, and asked if he had not been sleeping a little. Yes, lord, answered Owain, thou hast slept a while. Is it time for us to go to meat? It is, lord, said Owain. Then the horn for washing was sounded, and the king and all his household sat down to eat. And when the meal was ended, Owain withdrew to his lodging, and made ready his horse and his arms. On the morrow, with the dawn of day, he put on his armor, and mounted his charger, and travelled through distant lands and over desert mountains. And at length he arrived at the valley which Kynon had described to him, and he was certain that it was the same that he sought. And journeying along the valley by the side of the river, he followed its course till he came to the plain and within sight of the castle. When he approached the castle, he saw the youths shooting their daggers in the place where Kynon had seen them, and the yellow man to whom the castle belonged standing hard by. And no sooner had Owain saluted the yellow man than he was saluted by him in return. And he went forward towards the castle, and there he saw the chamber. And when he had entered the chamber, he beheld the maidens working at satin embroidery in chairs of gold. And their beauty and their comeliness seemed to Owain far greater than Kynon had represented to him. And they rose to wait upon Owain, as they had done to Kynon. And the meal which they set before him gave more satisfaction to Owain than it had done to Kynon. About the middle of the repast, the yellow man asked Owain the object of his journey. And Owain made it known to him, and said, I am in quest of the knight who guards the fountain. Upon this the yellow man smiled, and said that he was as loth to point out that adventure to Owain as he had been to Kynon. However, he described the whole to Owain, and they retired to rest. The next morning Owain found his horse made ready for him by the damsels, and he set forward and came to the glade where the black man was. And the stature of the black man seemed more wonderful to Owain than it had done to Kynon. And Owain asked of him his road, and he showed it to him. And Owain followed the road as Kynon had done, till he came to the green tree. And he beheld the fountain, and the slab behind the fountain, with the bowl upon it. And Owain took the bowl, and threw a bowlful of water upon the slab. And lo, the thunder was heard. And after the thunder came the shower, much more violent than Kynon had described. And after the shower the sky became bright. And when Owain looked at the tree, there was not one leaf upon it. And immediately the birds came and settled upon the tree and sang. And when their song was most pleasing to Owain, he beheld a knight coming towards him through the valley. And he prepared to receive him, and he encountered him violently. Having broken both their lances, they drew their swords, and fought blade to blade. Then Owain struck the knight a blow through his helmet, headpiece and visor, and through the skin and the flesh and the bone, until it wounded the very brain. Then the Black Knight felt that he had received a mortal wound, upon which he turned his horse's head and fled. And Owain pursued him and followed close upon him, although he was not near enough to strike him with his sword. Thereupon Owain descried a vast and resplendent castle, and they came to the castle gate. And the Black Knight was allowed to enter, and the portcullis was let fall upon Owain, and it struck his horse behind the saddle and cut him in two, and carried away the rowels of the spurs that were upon Owain's heels. And the portcullis descended to the floor, and the rowels of the spurs and part of the horse were without. And Owain, with the other part of the horse, remained between the two gates, and the inner gate was closed, so that Owain could not go thence, and Owain was in a perplexing situation. And while he was in this state, he could see through an aperture in the gate a street facing him, with a row of houses on each side. And he beheld a maiden with yellow curling hair, and a frontlet of gold upon her head, and she was clad in a dress of yellow satin, and on her feet were shoes of variegated leather. And she approached the gate, and desired that it should be opened. "Heaven knows, lady," said Owain, It is no more possible for me to open to thee from hence than it is for thee to set me free.
Truly, said the damsel, it is very sad that thou canst not be released, and every woman ought to succor thee, for I never saw one more faithful in the service of ladies than thou. As a friend thou art the most sincere, and as a lover the most devoted. Therefore, quoth she, whatever is in my power to do for thy release, I will do it. Take this ring and put it on thy finger, with the stone inside thy hand, and close thy hand upon the stone. And as long as thou concealest it, it will conceal thee. When they have consulted together, they will come forth to fetch thee, in order to put thee to death. And they will be much grieved that they cannot find thee. And I will await thee on the horse block yonder, and thou wilt be able to see me, though I cannot see thee. Therefore come and place thy hand upon my shoulder, that I may know that thou art near me. And by the way that I go hence, do thou accompany me.
Then she went away from Owain, and he did all that the maiden had told him. And the people of the castle came to seek Owain to put him to death, and when they found nothing but the half of his horse, they were sorely grieved. And Owain vanished from among them, and went to the maiden, and placed his hand upon her shoulder, whereupon she set off, and Owain followed her, until they came to the door of a large and beautiful chamber. And the maiden opened it, and they went in, and closed the door. And Owain looked around the chamber, and behold, there was not even a single nail in it that was not painted with gorgeous colours, and there was not a single panel that had not sundry images in gold portrayed upon it. The maiden kindled a fire, and took water in a silver bowl, and put a towel of white linen on her shoulder, and gave Owain water to wash. Then she placed before him a silver table inlaid with gold, upon which was a cloth of yellow linen, and she brought him food. And of a truth, Owain had never seen any kind of meat that was not there in abundance, but it was better cooked there than he had ever found it in any other place. Nor did he ever see so excellent a display of meat and drink as there. And there was not one vessel from which he was served that was not of gold or of silver. And Owain ate and drank until late in the afternoon, when lo, they heard a mighty clamour in the castle. And Owain asked the maiden what that outcry was.
They are administering extreme unction, said she, to the nobleman who owns the castle.
And Owain went to sleep. The couch which the maiden had prepared for him was meet for Arthur himself. It was of scarlet and fur and satin and sendal and fine linen. In the middle of the night they heard a woeful outcry. "What outcry again is this?" said Owain.
"The nobleman who owned the castle is now dead,"
said the maiden. And a little after daybreak they heard an exceeding loud clamour and wailing. And Owain asked the maiden what was the cause of it.
"They are bearing to the church the body of the nobleman who owned the castle."
And Owain rose up and clothed himself, and opened a window of the chamber, and looked towards the castle. And he could see neither the bounds nor the extent of the hosts that filled the streets. And they were fully armed. And a vast number of women were with them, both on horseback and on foot, and all the ecclesiastics in the city singing. And it seemed to Owain that the sky resounded with the vehemence of their cries, and with the noise of the trumpets, and with the singing of the ecclesiastics. In the midst of the throng he beheld the bier, over which was a veil of white linen, and wax tapers were burning beside and around it. And none that supported the bier was lower in rank than a powerful baron. Never did Owain see an assemblage so gorgeous with satin and silk and sendal. And following the train he beheld a lady with yellow hair falling over her shoulders, and stained with blood, and about her a dress of yellow satin which was torn. Upon her feet were shoes of variegated leather. And it was a marvel that the ends of her fingers were not bruised from the violence with which she smote her hands together. Truly she would have been the fairest lady Owain ever saw, had she been in her usual guise. And her cry was louder than the shout of the men or the clamour of the trumpets.
No sooner had he beheld the lady than he became inflamed with her love, so that it took entire possession of him. Then he inquired of the maiden who the lady was. "Heaven knows," replied the maiden. "She may be said to be the fairest, and the most chaste, and the most liberal, and the wisest, and the most noble of women. And she is my mistress, and she is called the Countess of the Fountain, the wife of him whom thou didst slay yesterday." "Verily," said Owain, "she is the woman that I love best." "Verily," said the maiden, "she shall also love thee not a little." And with that the maid arose and kindled a fire, and filled a pot with water, and placed it to warm. And she brought a towel of white linen, and placed it around Owain's neck. And she took a goblet of ivory, and a silver basin, and filled them with warm water, wherewith she washed Owain's head. Then she opened a wooden casket, and drew forth a razor, whose haft was of ivory, and upon which were 2 rivets of gold. And she shaved his beard, and she dried his head and his throat with the towel. Then she rose up from before Owain, and brought him to eat. And truly Owain never had so good a meal, nor was he ever so well served. When he had finished his repast, the maiden arranged his couch. "Come here," said she, "and sleep, and I will go and woo for thee." And Owain went to sleep, and the maiden shut the door of the chamber after her, and went towards the castle. When she came there, she found nothing but mourning and sorrow, and the countess in her chamber could not bear the sight of any one through grief. Luned came and saluted her, but the countess answered her not. And the maiden bent down towards her, and said, "What aileth thee that thou answerest no one today?" "Luned," said the countess, "what change hath befallen thee, that thou hast not come to visit me in my grief? It was wrong in thee, and I have made thee rich. It was wrong in thee that thou didst not come to see me in my distress. That was wrong in thee." "Truly," said Luned, "I thought thy good sense was greater than I find it to be. Is it well for thee to mourn after that good man, or for anything else that thou canst not have?" "I declare to heaven," said the countess, "that in the whole world there is not a man equal to him." "Not so," said Luned, "for an ugly man would be as good as or better than he." "I declare to heaven," said the countess, "that were it not repugnant to me to cause to be put to death one whom I have brought up, I would have thee executed for making such a comparison to me. As it is, I will banish thee." "I am glad," said Luned, "that thou hast no other cause to do so, than that I would have been of service to thee, where thou didst not know what was to thine advantage. And henceforth evil betide whichever us shall make the first advance towards reconciliation to the other, whether I should seek an invitation from thee, or thou of thine own accord shouldst send to invite me." With that Luned went forth, and the countess arose and followed her to the door of the chamber, and began coughing loudly. And when Luned looked back, the countess beckoned to her, and she returned to the countess. "In truth," said the countess, "evil is thy disposition, but if thou knowest what is to my advantage, declare it to me." "I will do so," quoth she. "Thou knowest that except by warfare and arms it is impossible for thee to preserve thy possessions. Delay not, therefore, to seek someone who can defend them." "And how can I do that?" said the countess. "I will tell thee," said Luned. "Unless thou canst defend the fountain, thou canst not maintain thy dominions, and no one can defend the fountain except it be a knight of Arthur's household. And I will go to Arthur's court, and ill betide me if I return thence without a warrior who can guard the fountain as well as, or even better, than he who defended it formerly." "That will be hard to perform," said the countess. "Go, however, and make proof of that which thou hast promised." Luned set out under the pretence of going to Arthur's court, but she went back to the chamber where she had left Owain, and she tarried there with him as long as it might have taken her to have travelled to the court of King Arthur. And at the end of that time she apparelled herself and went to visit the countess. And the countess was much rejoiced when she saw her, and inquired what news she brought from the court. I bring thee the best of news, said Luned, for I have compassed the object of my mission. When wilt thou that I should present to thee the chieftain who has come with me hither? Bring him here to visit me tomorrow at midday, said the countess, and I will cause the town to be assembled by that time. And Luned returned home, and the next day at noon Owain arrayed himself in a coat and a surcoat and a mantle of yellow satin, upon which was a broad band of gold lace, and on his feet were high shoes of variegated leather, which were fastened by golden clasps in the form of lions. And they proceeded to the chamber of the countess. Right glad was the countess of their coming, and she gazed steadfastly upon Owain and said, Luned, this knight has not the look of a traveller. What harm is there in that, lady? Said Luned. I am certain, said the countess, that no other man than this chased the soul from the body of my lord. So much the better for thee, lady, said Luned, for had he not been stronger than thy lord, he could not have deprived him of life. There is no remedy for that which is past, be it as it may. Go back to thine abode, said the countess, and I will take counsel. Next day the countess caused all her subjects to assemble, and showed them that her earldom was left defenceless, and that it could not be protected but with horse and arms and military skill. Therefore, said she, this is what I offer for your choice. Either let one of you take me, or give your consent for me to take a husband from elsewhere to defend my dominions. So they came to the determination that it was better that she should have permission to marry someone from elsewhere, and thereupon she sent for the bishops and archbishops to celebrate her nuptials with Owain. And the men of the earldom did Owain homage. And Owain defended the fountain with lance and sword. And this is the manner in which he defended it. Whensoever a knight came there, he overthrew him, and sold him for his full worth. And what he thus gained, he divided among his barons and his knights. And no man in the whole world could be more beloved than he was by his subjects. And it was thus for the space of 3 years. It befell that as Gwalchmai went forth one day with King Arthur, he perceived him to be very sad and sorrowful. And Gwalchmai was much grieved to see Arthur in this state. And he questioned him, saying, O my lord, what has befallen thee? In sooth, Gwalchmai, said Arthur, I am grieved concerning Owain, whom I have lost these 3 years, and I shall certainly die if the 4th year passes without my seeing him. Now I am sure that it is through the tale which Canon the son of Clydno related that I have lost Owain. There is no need for thee, said Gwalchmai, to summon to arms thy whole dominions on this account. For thou thyself and the men of thy household will be able to avenge Owain if he be slain, or to set him free if he be in prison, and if alive to bring him back with thee. And it was settled according to what Gwalchmai had said. Then Arthur and the men of his household prepared to go and seek Owain, and their number was 3,000, besides their attendants. And Canon the son of Clydno acted as their guide. And Arthur came to the castle where Canon had been before. And when he came there, the youths were shooting in the same place, and the yellow man was standing hard by. When the yellow man saw Arthur, he greeted him and invited him to the castle. And Arthur accepted his invitation, and they entered the castle together. And great as was the number of his retinue, their presence was hardly observed in the castle, so vast was its extent. And the maidens rose up to wait on them, and the service of the maiden appeared to them all to excel any attendants they had ever met with. And even the pages who had charge of the horses were no worse served that night than Arthur himself would have been in his own palace. The next morning Arthur set out thence, with Canon for his guide, and came to the place where the black man was. And the stature of the black man was more surprising to Arthur than it had been represented to him. And they came to the top of the wooded steep, and traversed the valley till they reached the green tree, where they saw the fountain and the bowl and the slab. And upon that Kai came to Arthur and spoke to him. My lord, said he, I know the meaning of all this,
and my request is that thou wilt permit me to throw the water on the slab, and to receive the first adventure that may befall. And Arthur gave him leave. And then Kai threw a bowlful of water upon the slab, and immediately there came the thunder, and after the thunder the shower, and such a thunderstorm they had never known before. And many of the attendants who were in Arthur's train were killed by the shower. After the shower had ceased, the sky became clear, and on looking at the tree they beheld it completely leafless. Then the birds descended upon the tree, and the song of the birds was far sweeter than any strain they had ever heard before. Then they beheld a knight on a coal-black horse, clothed in black satin, coming rapidly towards them. And Kai met him and encountered him, and it was not long before Kai was overthrown. And the knight withdrew, and Arthur and his host encamped for the night. And when they arose in the morning, they perceived the signal of combat upon the lance of the knight. And Kai came to Arthur and spoke to him. "My lord," said he, "though I was overthrown yesterday, if it seemed good to thee, I would gladly meet the knight again today." "Thou mayst do so," said Arthur. And Kai went towards the knight, and on the spot he overthrew Kai, and struck him with the head of his lance in the forehead, so that it broke his helmet and the headpiece, and pierced the skin and the flesh, the breadth of the spearhead, even to the bone. And Kai returned to his companions. After this, all the household of Arthur went forth, one after the other, to combat the knight, until there was not one that was not overthrown by him, except Arthur and Gwalchmai. And Arthur armed himself to encounter the knight. "O my lord," said Gwalchmai, "permit me to fight with him first." And Arthur permitted him. And he went forth to meet the knight, having over himself and his horse a satin robe of honour, which had been sent him by the daughter of the Earl of Rangu. And in this dress he was not known by any of the host. And they charged each other, and fought all that day until the evening, and neither of them was able to unhorse the other. The next day they fought with strong lances, and neither of them could obtain the mastery. And the third day they fought with exceeding strong lances, and they were incensed with rage, and fought furiously even until noon. And they gave each other such a shock that the girths of their horses were broken, so that they fell over their horses' cruppers to the ground. And they rose up speedily, and drew their swords, and resumed the combat. And the multitude that witnessed their encounter felt assured that they had never before seen two men so valiant or so powerful. And had it been midnight, it would have been light from the fire that flashed from their weapons. And the knight gave Gwalchmai a blow that turned his helmet from off his face, so that the knight knew that it was Gwalchmai. Then Owain said, "My lord Gwalchmai, I did not know thee for my cousin, owing to the robe of honour that enveloped thee." "Take my sword in my arms," said Gwalchmai. "Thou, Owain, art the victor. Take thou my sword." And with that Arthur saw that they were conversing, and advanced towards them. "My lord Arthur," said Gwalchmai, "here is Owain, who has vanquished me, and will not take my arms." "My lord," said Owain, "it is he that has vanquished me, and he will not take my sword." "Give me your swords," said Arthur, "and then neither of you has vanquished the other." Then Owain put his arms around Arthur's neck, and they embraced. And all the host hurried forward to see Owain and to embrace him. And there was nigh being a loss of life, so great was the press. And they retired that night, and the next day Arthur prepared to depart. "My lord," said Owain, "this is not well of thee, for I have been absent from thee these 3 years, and during all that time, up to this very day, I have been preparing a banquet for thee, knowing that thou wouldst come to seek me. Tarry with me, therefore, until thou and thy attendants have recovered the fatigues of the journey, and have been anointed." And they all proceeded to the castle of the Countess of the Fountain, and the banquet which had been 3 years preparing was consumed in 3 months. Never had they a more delicious or agreeable banquet. And Arthur prepared to depart. Then he sent an embassy to the Countess, to beseech her to permit Owain to go with him for the space of 3 months, that he might show him to the nobles and the fair dames of the island of Britain. And the countess gave her consent, although it was very painful to her. So Owain came with Arthur to the island of Britain, and when he was once more amongst his kindred and friends, he remained 3 years instead of 3 months with them. And as Owain one day sat at meat in the city of Caerleon upon Usk, behold, a damsel entered upon a bay horse, with a curling mane and covered with foam, and the bridle and so much as was seen of the saddle were of gold. And the damsel was arrayed in a dress of yellow satin. And she came up to Owain and took the ring from off his hand.
"Thus," said she, "shall be treated the deceiver, the traitor, the faithless, the disgraced, and the beardless." And she turned her horse's head and departed. Then his adventure came to Owain's remembrance, and he was sorrowful. And having finished eating, he went to his own abode, and made preparations that night. And the next day he arose, but did not go to the court, but wandered to the distant parts of the earth and to uncultivated mountains. And he remained there until all his apparel was worn out, and his body was wasted away, and his hair was grown long. And he went about with the wild beasts and fed with them, until they became familiar with him. But at length he grew so weak that he could no longer bear them company. Then he descended from the mountains to the valley, and came to a park that was the fairest in the world, and belonged to a widowed countess. One day the countess and her maidens went forth to walk by a lake that was in the middle of the park, and they saw the form of a man, and they were terrified. Nevertheless they went near him, and touched him, and looked at him, and they saw that there was life in him, though he was exhausted by the heat of the sun. And the countess returned to the castle, and took a flask full of precious ointment, and gave it to one of her maidens. "Go with this," said she, "and take with thee yonder horse and clothing, and place them near the man we saw just now, and anoint him with this balsam near his heart. And if there is life in him, he will arise through the efficacy of this balsam. Then watch what he will do." And the maiden departed from her, and poured the whole of the balsam upon Owain, and left the horse and the garments hard by, and went a little way off, and hid herself to watch him. In a short time she saw him begin to move his arms, and he rose up, and looked at his person, and became ashamed of the unseemliness of his appearance. Then he perceived the horse and the garments that were near him, and he crept forward till he was able to draw the garments to him from off the saddle. And he clothed himself, and with difficulty mounted the horse. Then the damsel discovered herself to him, and saluted him. And he was rejoiced when he saw her, and inquired of her what land and what territory that was. "Truly," said the maiden, "a widowed countess owns yonder castle. At the death of her husband he left her 2 earldoms, but at this day she has but this one dwelling that has not been wrested from her by a young earl, who is her neighbor, because she refused to become his wife." "That is pity," said Owain. And he and the maiden proceeded to the castle. And he alighted there, and the maiden conducted him to a pleasant chamber, and kindled a fire, and left him. And the maiden came to the countess, and gave the flask into her hand. "Ha, maiden," said the countess, "where is all the balsam?" "Have I not used it all?" said she. "Oh, maiden," said the countess, "I cannot easily forgive thee this. It is sad for me to have wasted 70 pounds worth of precious ointment upon a stranger whom I know not. However, maiden, wait thou upon him until he is quite recovered." And the maiden did so, and furnished him with meat and drink, and fire and lodging, and medicaments, until he was well again. And in 3 months he was restored to his former guise, and became even more comely than he had ever been before. One day Owain heard a great tumult and a sound of arms in the castle, and he inquired of the maiden the cause thereof. "The earl," said she, "whom I mentioned to thee, has come before the castle with a numerous army to subdue the countess." And Owain inquired of her whether the countess had a horse and arms in her possession. "She has the best in the world," said the maiden. "Wilt thou go and request the loan of a horse and arms for me," said Owain, "that I may go and look at this army?" "I will," said the maiden. And she came to the countess and told her what Owain had said. And the countess laughed. "Truly," said she, "I will even give him a horse and arms forever. Such a horse and such arms had he never yet. And I am glad that they should be taken by him today, lest my enemy should have them against my will tomorrow. Yet I know not what he would do with them." The countess bade them bring out a beautiful black steed, upon which was a beechen saddle and a suit of armor for man and horse. And Owain armed himself and mounted the horse, and went forth, attended by 2 pages completely equipped with horses and arms. And when they came near to the earl's army, they could see neither its extent nor its extremity. And Owain asked the pages in which troop the earl was. "In yonder troop," said they, "in which are 4 yellow standards. 2 of them are before, and 2 behind him." "Now," said Owain, "do your return, and await me near the portal of the castle." So they returned, and Owain pressed forward until he met the earl. And Owain drew him completely out of his saddle, and turned his horse's head towards the castle, and though it was with difficulty, he brought the earl to the portal, where the pages awaited him. And in they came. And Owain presented the earl as a gift to the countess, and said to her, "Behold a requital to thee for thy blessed balsam." The army encamped around the castle, and the earl restored to the countess the 2 earldoms he had taken from her as a ransom for his life, and for his freedom he gave her the half of his own dominions, and all his gold and his silver and his jewels, besides hostages. And Owain took his departure, and the countess and all her subjects besought him to remain, but Owain chose rather to wander through distant lands and deserts. And as he journeyed, he heard a loud yelling in a wood, and it was repeated a second and a third time. And Owain went towards the spot, and beheld a huge craggy mound in the middle of the wood, on the side of which was a grey rock. And there was a cleft in the rock, and a serpent was within the cleft. And near the rock stood a black lion, and every time the lion sought to go thence, the serpent darted towards him to attack him. And Owain unsheathed his sword and drew near to the rock. And as the serpent sprang out, he struck him with his sword and cut him in 2. And he dried his sword and went on his way as before. But behold, the lion followed him and played about him, as though it had been a greyhound that he had reared. They proceeded thus throughout the day until the evening. And when it was time for Owain to take his rest, he dismounted and turned his horse loose in a flat and wooded meadow. And he struck fire, and when the fire was kindled, the lion brought him fuel enough to last for 3 nights, and the lion disappeared. And presently the lion returned, bearing a fine large roebuck, and he threw it down before Owain, who went towards the fire with it. And Owain took the roebuck and skinned it, and placed collops of its flesh upon skewers around the fire. The rest of the buck he gave to the lion to devour. While he was doing this, he heard a deep sigh near him, and a second, and a third. And Owain called out to know whether the sigh he heard proceeded from a mortal, and he received the answer that it did. "Who art thou?" said Owain. "Truly," said the voice, "I am Luned, the handmaiden of the Countess of the Fountain." "And what dost thou here?" said Owain. "I am imprisoned," said she, "on account of the knight who came from Arthur's court and married the countess. And he stayed a short time with her, but he afterwards departed for the court of Arthur, and has not returned since. And he was the friend I loved best in the world. And 2 of the pages in the countess's chamber traduced him, and called him a deceiver. And I told them that they 2 were not a match for him alone. So they imprisoned me in the stone vault, and said that I should be put to death unless he came himself to deliver me by a certain day, and that is no further off than the day after tomorrow. And I have no one to send to seek him for me. And his name is Owain, the son of Urien." "And art thou certain that if that knight knew all this, he would come to thy rescue?" "I am most certain of it," said she. When the collops were cooked, Owain divided them into 2 parts between himself and the maiden. And after they had eaten, they talked together until the day dawned. And the next morning Owain inquired of the damsel if there was any place where he could get food and entertainment for that night. "There is, lord," said she. "Cross over yonder, and go along the side of the river, and in a short time thou wilt see a great castle in which are many towers, and the earl who owns that castle is the most hospitable man in the world. There thou mayest spend the night." Never did sentinel keep stricter watch over his lord than the lion that night over Owain. And Owain accoutred his horse, and passed across by the ford, and came in sight of the castle. And he entered it, and was honourably received. And his horse was well cared for, and plenty of fodder was placed before him. Then the lion went and lay down in the horse's manger, so that none of the people of the castle dared to approach him. The treatment which Owain met with there was such as he had never known elsewhere, for every one was as sorrowful as though death had come upon him. And they went to meat, and the earl sat upon one side of Owain, and on the other side his only daughter. And Owain had never seen any more lovely than she. Then the lion came and placed himself between Owain's feet, and he fed him with every kind of food that he took himself, and he never saw anything equal to the sadness of the people. In the middle of the repast the earl began to bid Owain welcome. "Then," said Owain, "behold, it is time for thee to be cheerful." "Heaven knows," said the earl, "that it is not thy coming that makes us sorrowful, but we have cause enough for sadness and care." "What is that?" said Owain. "I have 2 sons," replied the earl, "and yesterday they went to the mountains to hunt. Now there is on the mountain a monster who kills men and devours them, and he seized my sons. And tomorrow is the time he has fixed to be here, and he threatens that he will then slay my sons before my eyes, unless I will deliver into his hands this my daughter. He has the form of a man, but in stature he is no less than a giant." "Truly," said Owain, "that is lamentable. And which wilt thou do?" "Heaven knows," said the earl. "It will be better that my son should be slain against my will than that I should voluntarily give up my daughter to him to ill-treat and destroy." Then they talked about other things, and Owain stayed there that night. The next morning they heard an exceeding great clamour, which was caused by the coming of the giant with the 2 youths. And the earl was anxious both to protect his castle and to release his 2 sons. Then Owain put on his armour, and went forth to encounter the giant, and the lion followed him. And when the giant saw that Owain was armed, he rushed towards him and attacked him. And the lion fought with the giant much more fiercely than Owain did. "Truly," said the giant, "I should find no difficulty in fighting with thee, were it not for the animal that is with thee." Upon that Owain took the lion back to the castle, and shut the gate upon him, and then he returned to fight the giant as before. And the lion roared very loud, for he heard that it went hard with Owain. And he climbed up till he reached the top of the earl's hall, and then he got to the top of the castle, and he sprang down from the walls, and went and joined Owain. And the lion gave the giant a stroke with his paw, which tore him from his shoulder to his hip, and his heart was laid bare, and the giant fell down dead. Then Owain restored the 2 youths to their father. The earl besought Owain to remain with him, and he would not, but set forward towards the meadow where Luned was. And when he came there, he saw a great fire kindled, and 2 youths with beautiful curling auburn hair were leading the maiden to cast her into the fire. And Owain asked them what charge they had against her, and they told him of the compact that was between them, as the maiden had done the night before. "And," said they, "Owain has failed her, therefore we are taking her to be burnt." "Truly," said Owain, "he is a good knight, and if he knew that the maiden was in such peril, I marvel that he came not to her rescue. But if you will accept me in his stead, I will do battle with you." "We will," said the youths, "by him who made us." And they attacked Owain, and he was hard beset by them. And with that the lion came to Owain's assistance, and they too got the better of the young men. And they said to him, "Chieftain, it was not agreed that we should fight save with thyself alone, and it is harder for us to contend with yonder animal than with thee." And Owain put the lion in the place where the maiden had been imprisoned, and blocked up the door with stones, and he went to fight with the young men as before. But Owain was not his usual strength, and the two youths pressed hard upon him, and the lion roared incessantly at seeing Owain in trouble, and he burst through the wall until he found a way out, and rushed upon the young men, and instantly slew them. So Luned was saved from being burned. Then Owain returned with Luned to the dominions of the Countess of the Fountain. And when he went thence, he took the Countess with him to Arthur's court, and she was his wife as long as she lived. And then he took the road that led to the court of the savage black man, and Owain fought with him, and the lion did not quit Owain until he had vanquished him. And when he reached the court of the savage black man, he entered the hall, and beheld 24 ladies, the fairest that could be seen, and the garments which they had on were not worth 24 pence, and they were as sorrowful as death. And Owain asked them the cause of their sadness, and they said, "We are the daughters of earls, and we all came here with our husbands whom we dearly loved, and we were received with honor and rejoicing. And we were thrown into a state of stupor, and while we were thus, the demon who owns this castle slew all our husbands, and took from us our horses, and our raiment, and our gold, and our silver. And the corpses of our husbands are still in this house, and many others with them. And this, chieftain, is the cause of our grief, and we are sorry that thou art come hither, lest harm should befall thee." And Owain was grieved when he heard this, and he went forth from the castle, and he beheld a knight approaching him, who saluted him in a friendly and cheerful manner, as if he had been a brother. And this was the savage black man. "In very sooth," said Owain, "it is not to seek thy friendship that I am here." "In sooth," said he, "thou shalt not find it then." And with that they charged each other, and fought furiously. And Owain overcame him, and bound his hands behind his back. Then the black savage besought Owain to spare his life, and spoke thus: "My lord Owain," said he, "it was foretold that thou shouldst come hither and vanquish me, and thou hast done so. I was a robber here, and my house was a house of spoil. But grant me my life, and I will become the keeper of an hospice, and I will maintain this house as an hospice for weak and for strong, as long as I live, for the good of thy soul." And Owain accepted this proposal of him, and remained there that night. And the next day he took the 24 ladies, and their horses, and their raiment, and what they possessed of goods and jewels, and proceeded with them to Arthur's court. And if Arthur was rejoiced when he saw him, after he had lost him the first time, his joy now was much greater. And of those ladies, such as wished to remain in Arthur's court remained there, and such as wished to depart departed. And thenceforward Owain dwelt at Arthur's court greatly beloved, as the head of his household, until he went away with his followers. And those were the army of 300 ravens, which Kenverchin had left him. And wherever Owain went with these he was victorious. And this is the tale of the Lady of the Fountain. End of The Lady of the Fountain in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. Read by Glenn Turner, Menifee, California, March 10th, 2022.
Goso the Teacher in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ahana Malik. Goso the Teacher by George W. Bateman. Once there was a man named Goso, who taught children to read not in a schoolhouse but under a calabash tree. One evening, while Goso was sitting under the tree, deep in the study of the next day's lessons, Pa the gazelle climbed up the tree very quietly to steal some fruit, and in so doing shook off a calabash, which, in falling, struck the teacher on the head and killed him. When his scholars came in the morning and found their teacher lying dead, they were filled with grief. So after giving him a decent burial, they agreed among themselves to find the one who had killed Goso and put him to death. After talking the matter over, they came to the conclusion that the south wind was the offender. So they caught the south wind and beat it. But the south wind cried, "Here, I'm Kusi, the south wind. Why are you beating me? What have I done?" And they said, "Yes, we know you are Kusi. It was you who threw down the calabash that struck our teacher Goso. You should not have done it." But Kusi said, "If I were so powerful, would I be stopped by a mud wall?" So they went to the mud wall and beat it. But the mud wall cried, "Here, I'm Kiambaza, the mud wall. Why are you beating me? What have I done?" And they said, "Yes, we know you are Kiambaza. It was you who stopped Kusi, the south wind. And Kusi, the south wind, threw down the calabash that struck our teacher Goso. You should not have done it." But Kiambaza said, "If I were so powerful, would I be bored through by the rat?" So they went and caught the rat and beat it. But the rat cried, "Here, I'm Panya, the rat. Why are you beating me? What have I done?" And they said, "Yes, we know you are Panya. It was you who bored through Kiambaza, the mud wall, which stopped Kusi, the south wind, and Kusi, the south wind, threw down the calabash that struck our teacher Goso. You should not have done it." But Panya said, "If I were so powerful, would I be eaten by a cat?" So they hunted for the cat, caught it, and beat it. But the cat cried, "Here, I'm Paka, the cat. Why do you beat me? What have I done?" And they said, "Yes, we know you're Paka. It is you that eats Panya, the rat, who bores through Kiambaza, the mud wall, which stopped Kusi, the south wind, and Kusi, the south wind, threw down the calabash that struck our teacher Goso. You should not have done it." But Paka said, "If I were so powerful, would I be tied by a rope?" So they took the rope and beat it. But the rope cried, "Here, I'm Kamba, the rope. Why do you beat me? What have I done?" And they said, "Yes, we know you are Kamba. It is you that ties Paka, the cat, who eats Panya, the rat, who bores through Kiambaza, the mud wall, which stopped Kusi, the south wind, and Kusi, the south wind, threw down the calabash that struck our teacher Goso. You should not have done it." But Kamba said, "If I were so powerful, would I be cut by a knife?" So they took the knife and beat it. But the knife cried, "Here, I'm Kisu, the knife. Why do you beat me? What have I done?" And they said, "Yes, we know you're Kisu. You cut Kamba, the rope, that ties Paka, the cat, who eats Panya, the rat, who bores through Kiambaza, the mud wall, which stopped Kusi, the south wind. And Kusi, the south wind, threw down the calabash that struck our teacher Goso. You should not have done it." But Kisu said, "If I were so powerful, would I be burned by the fire?" And they went and beat the fire. But the fire cried, "Here, I'm Moto, the fire. Why do you beat me? What have I done?" And they said, "Yes, we know you're Moto. You burn Kisu, the knife, that cuts Kamba, the rope, that ties Paka, the cat, who eats Panya, the rat, who bores through Kiambaza, the mud wall, which stopped Kusi, the south wind, and Kusi, the south wind, threw down the calabash that struck our teacher Goso. You should not have done it." But Moto said, "If I were so powerful, would I be put out by water?" And they went to the water and beat it. But the water cried, "Here, I'm Maji, the water. Why do you beat me? What have I done?" And they said, "Yes, we know you are Maji. You put out Moto, the fire, that burns Kisu, the knife, that cuts Kamba, the rope, that ties Paka, the cat, who eats Panya, the rat, who bores through Kiambaza, the mud wall, which stopped Kusi, the south wind, and Kusi, the south wind, threw down the calabash that struck our teacher Goso. You should not have done it. But Maji said, if I were so powerful, would I be drunk by the ox? And they went to the ox and beat it. But the ox cried, Here, I'm Nagombe, the ox. Why do you beat me? What have I done? And they said, Yes, we know you're Nagombe. You drink Maji, the water, that puts out Moto, the fire, that burns Kisu, the knife, that cuts Kamba, the rope, that ties Paka, the cat, who eats Panya, the rat, who bores through Kiambaza, the mud wall, which stopped Kusi, the south wind, and Kusi, the south wind, threw down the calabash that struck our teacher Goso. You should not have done it. But Nagombe said, if I were so powerful, would I be tormented by the fly? And they caught a fly and beat it. But the fly cried, Here, Anenzi, the fly, why do you beat me? What have I done? And they said, Yes, we know you're Inzi. You torment Nagombe, the ox, who drinks Maji, the water, that puts out Moto, the fire, that burns Kisu, the knife, that cuts Kamba, the rope, that ties Paka, the cat, who eats Panya, the rat, who bores through Kiambaza, the mud wall, which stopped Kusi, the south wind. And Kusi, the south wind, threw down the calabash that struck our teacher Goso. You should not have done it. But Inzi said, if I were so powerful, would I be eaten by the gazelle? And they searched for the gazelle, and when they found it, they beat it. But the gazelle said, Here, I'm Pa, the gazelle. Why do you beat me? What have I done? And they said, Yes, we know you are Pa. You eat Inzi, the fly, that torments Nagombe, the ox, who drinks Maji, the water, that puts out Moto, the fire, that burns Kisu, the knife, that cuts Kamba, the rope, that ties Paka, the cat, who eats Panya, the rat, who bores through Kiambaza, the mud wall, which stopped Kusi, the south wind, and Kusi, the south wind, threw down the calabash that struck our teacher Goso. You should not have done it. The gazelle, through surprise at being found out and fear of the consequences of his accidental killing of the teacher, while engaged in stealing, was struck dumb. Then the scholars said, Ah, he hasn't a word to say for himself. This is the fellow who threw down the calabash that struck our teacher Goso. We will kill him. So they killed Pa, the gazelle, and avenged the death of their teacher. End of Goso the Teacher in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 14.